markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P. They are both higher right now. NASDAQ trading lower. NASDAQ down 30, drop there of 0.2%. S&P up 17 at 54.82, up 0.3%, while the Dow is up 364, up by 0.9%. A renewed bout of volatility is gripping stocks as a plunge in NVIDIA raises concern that the rally in big techs and the overall market is due for a breather. NVIDIA shares down now by 4.8%. 10-year, 4.26%. The 2-year, 4.74%. Gold up 0.3%, 23.29 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.9%, 81.43 a barrel. Apple's antitrust feud with the European Union over allegedly illegal practices on the App Store intensified today as watchdogs issued a fresh warning that could lead to more fines months after they slapped the iPhone maker with a $1.9 billion penalty for thwarting music streaming rivals. Shares of Apple, they're up today. We've got Apple advancing now by just about 2.2%. Again, recapping, S&P up 17, up 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Powell, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. And we're also streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you will find us. Well, for the month of June, Bloomberg Radio is committed to bringing you segments and guests focused on the topic of equality. Today, we're speaking with Mike Hyter, President and CEO of Executive Leadership Council. Mike, thanks so much for joining us here. Tell us what the Executive Leadership Council is. What are you guys doing over there?
Well, it's good. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. I appreciate it. The Executive Leadership Council, otherwise known as the ELC, we're an organization of the highest ranking Black executives in global organizations worldwide with a commitment to the leadership and development of talent in corporations. Been around 38 years. Right.
Good stuff. What are you finding these days, just in terms of overall that DEI concept, which had been ascendant for many years, and for some people it feels like it may have peaked? How do you view that commitment?
Well, the diversity, equity, and inclusion is and continues to be a very strong element element for organizations that are beneficial for them. Unfortunately, there's a lot of heated rhetoric about diversity, equity, inclusion, I guess, being perceived as reverse discrimination, which we fundamentally disagree with that assertion. It is failing to sort of readdress the facts that diversity, equity, inclusion has actually benefited the United States economy over the years, but it just has to be focused properly in order for that to happen.
How do we do that? How is it focused properly, and what are the steps that need to be taken now?
The steps should be that diversity, equity, inclusion should be considered the impetus behind superior business performance, increased access and opportunity for development for all people, and that focusing on building corporate culture to increase and enhance the engagement of as many employees as possible is what diversity, equity, and inclusion means. It doesn't mean lowering standards. So if it's applied as the significant contributor to the business driver that it is, then it will be strategically relevant in the organizations and less concerned as something that is being merely tolerated.
So, I mean, give us a sense how you think about this, Mike, and how your council thinks about this, because, again, it seems like DEI is sharing a similar type of situation or environment as ESG is, environmental social governance investing, as people are just kind of pushing back on both of those types of initiatives, whether it's from a political perspective or a business perspective. How do you think about that?
Well, it's unfortunate that that's been the case. We're focusing on, organizations need to be, and shareholders and customers are expecting, and employees are expecting companies to be peak performers. And specifically the ELC, we are corporate officers that are executives in major corporations around the world. So we look at the diversity, equity, inclusion as a piece of increasing the effectiveness of an organization's ability to be more profitable and be more successful, as how we would suggest organizations focus on it, as opposed to it being something that's perceived as a political issue.
What do you think would be helpful, Mike? Because to not politicize it just a few months before an election that will definitely politicize this, how do you sort of manage that? Yeah,
that's an excellent question, and I guess the challenge of the day. Our assessment on managing it is staying focused on what is required to be functional on the ground in organizations, and to be less, I guess, less defined by other people's assessment about what it is or it isn't. That's the only way we think is the best, I guess the best avenue is to be consistent for addressing what I call disparities in terms of numbers based on representation of talent within organizations, and to have talent strategies and development strategies that ensure that everybody is reaching their full potential in organizations as our suggestions for what organizations ought to do, and to stay focused on that independent of what it's called or independent of what the acronyms are that people are defining it by.
Mike, you mentioned that the ELC is a global council, global entity. Given your global view here, how is the U.S. doing on DEI initiatives, maybe versus some other parts of the world?
I think it is mixed relative to other parts of the world, but I do believe that the focus on productivity and team benefits globally is much more pronounced, and it's less defined by race and culture, and so it has less baggage, I guess, if you will, relative to how it's perceived globally than it does here in the United States. I think team productivity, maximizing the contributions of all types of folks, independent of their background or gender or sexual orientation, continues to be something that all organizations are striving towards. There are some companies who are more effective at it globally than others, but I just think the whole issue around the discussion that you all are referencing is primarily much more, I guess, aggressive in the United States, because I think there is an over-interpretation of this as a byproduct of a racial issue, as opposed to something that is looked at as a full production of all types of people, independent of race in the United States.
I think that's such a great point, that it gets stuck on race versus all diversity. Like, you need full diversity in order to sort of deliver that profitability, to deliver synergies, etc. So yeah, it's true. All right, Mike, we appreciate it. Thanks very much, Mike Heitcher, President and CEO of Executive Leadership Committee, ELC, joining us, Leadership Council, joining us on all the efforts through DEI. And, I wonder what this happens sort of once we get past November, Paul, like what the result will wind up being. Does this conversation get easier, get harder? Can we refocus it into diversity is good for many reasons? Here are the numbers that show it, versus making it a race issue at the end of the day.
Yep, exactly. If you can put it in the context of profitability and returns, that's probably what get the board's attention.
Exactly. All right, looking at our markets, pretty much mixed on this Monday. You're listening to Bloomberg Intelligence on Bloomberg Radio in the middle of New York. I don't think it's as hot, which is a good thing on a Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pelletin. Industrial and consumer packaging company Sonoco Products has agreed to buy Eviosys, that is a maker of cans and other packaging, from KPS Capital Partners for about $3.9 billion. U.S.-based Sonoco says the acquisition of Europe-focused Eviosys will create the leading metal food can and aerosol packaging manufacturer globally. Sonoco lower today by 3.6%. Alnylam Pharmaceutical shares are soaring 33% after its drug succeeded in treating a progressive and deadly form of heart disease, potentially opening up a new avenue for the company's top-selling product. Alnylam, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, again surging by 37.6%. Big banks are looking ahead to Wednesday. That's when we get the results from the Federal Reserve stress test. Tom Michaud, the CEO of Keefe, Bruyette & Woods, says the results are likely to show that U.S. banks are in good shape.
We have earnings models by quarter for net interest income. I think just about all of the 220 banks we follow, nearly all, are going to hit a bottom on a quarterly basis, either last quarter or this quarter. That's the reason why we upgraded Bank America, is the second quarter is the inflection point, and it gets better from here. So it's all a question of timing.
Tom Machad of Keefe, Briette, and Woods. And again, we've got banks pushing higher. He mentioned Bank of America. That stock up now by 1.8%. Citigroup up 1.7%. Goldman Sachs shares, they are up now by 1.9%. And JP Morgan Chase is advancing today by 1.1%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. We're live in Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business, economics, and finance through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries all around the world. We also keep you updated on all the world and national news that you need. And for that, we go to Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much. We're just 3 days away from the first debate in the 2024 rematch between President Biden and former President Trump. Bloomberg's Laura Davison reports a lot is riding on the CNN presidential debate for both candidates.
This will be the first time that these two men are appearing, in the same room since the 2020 election. And the things that people are looking for from Biden are, what does his stamina look like? Is he able to come on and appear presidential and like he has 4 more years in him? And with Trump, they're basically looking to see if he will be boring and act presidential.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison. Our coverage of the CNN presidential debate begins this Thursday night at 8 p.m. Wall Street time with a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio and television. Russia's southern region of Dagestan is holding the first of 3 days of mourning following a rampage by Islamic militants that killed 19 people, most of them police, and attacked houses of worship in apparently coordinated assaults on 2 cities. The Supreme Court says it will hear a case in its next term challenging statewide bans on medical treatments for transgender children. The justices will hear a case out of Tennessee involving a 15-year-old and her parents who say their state's law violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, discriminating against transgender youth when their doctors say certain treatments are medically necessary. Lawmakers in those states argue children are too young to be receiving drugs or surgery that may cause irreversible changes. Emory University law professor Fred Smith says the court could bring finality to all the litigation that's been going back and forth on laws affecting transgender care.
Otherwise, you're just kind of continue to have these laws being passed and this kind of whack-a-mole where different judges across the country are invalidating one after another.
Emory University law professor Fred Smith. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, Charlie.
All right, thanks so much, Michael Barr. Here is a wonderful story that caught my eye. The title on Bloomberg is Wall Street Shoe Shiners Turn to Cleaning Sneakers to Survive. So the looser dress codes mean that even CEOs, probably on a Friday, are ditching loafers and going for casual shoes. And so if you go down to Wall Street, ton of shoe shiners all over the place. And I guess they're pivoting now to cleaning sneakers.
All right, this is in my wheelhouse here. I still wear big boy shoes to work, okay? Here are the top shoe shine places based on my 38 years in New York City working. Number 1, Rockefeller Center down in the basement, the subway level. Those people are the best. They'll take a good 7 to 10 minutes shining your shoes, and it will be unbelievable, and it will last for a couple of weeks. Be prepared to wait because, again, it is the best in the city. The second best I found is downtown, Maiden Lane. Yeah, it's really going to go downtown in those little streets, but those folks are excellent as well. So depending upon your midtown or downtown, those are your 2 go-to places. We have a place around the corner here that's okay, but it's true. The traffic is down dramatically. I can go in there even at lunchtime today, and I'll be the only one in there.
So apparently search interest for office sneakers increased 181% since January of 2021. And now you have athletic shoemakers targeting office workers in a much bigger way. Like here is like athleisure wear shoes for work.
Right. And this is where, for some people, for the younger folks, it looks good. Now, someone I look up to from the dress code perspective is David Weston, because he's a professional. Ton of respect for David Weston in his career. He'll actually wear the sneaker things with the suit, and I was really That hurt me. That really disappointed me.
That cut you deep.
Exactly.
It cut deep.
I have so much respect for David West, and when I saw that, I said, "Oh boy."
He likes all birds. Also,
Yes.
I don't know what we make of that. All right, so David West can take note. Cut deep with Paul. Anyway, that wraps it up for Bloomberg Intelligence on this Monday. We'll be back with you tomorrow from Bloomberg Invest, so stay with us for that. Coming up, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's been 2 years since the end of Roe. Welcome to the fastest show in politics at the start of a critical week in the presidential campaign, considering the political impact of the Supreme Court's ruling 2 years ago today. We're going to talk about that coming up with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, the landscape 2 years later, an analysis with law professor Carol Sanger from Columbia University, who specializes in reproductive rights. President Biden, Donald Trump in prep now for the big debate this week, their first in 4 years. We'll get the latest on that from Bloomberg's Laura Davison with more on a busy weekend on the campaign trail and analysis from our signature panel. They're both here, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg politics contributors, all after we take a look at Wall Street. Let's start right there, right now, with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. And he is back. Big warm welcome back, Joe Matthew. We have got stocks trading mixed on this Back to Work Monday. S&P up 16, gain right now of 0.3%. We've got the Dow higher by 342, up by 0.9%. NASDAQ, though, down 40 points. That is a drop of 0.2%. 10-year, 4.26%. The 2-year, 4.73%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil right now up 1%, 81.58 a barrel, and spot gold up 0.2%, 23.27 the ounce on gold. So we've got a renewed bout of volatility gripping stocks, along with a plunge in Nvidia. Right now, we have got Nvidia down 4.7%. The AI-focused chipmaker entering correction territory as it extends that sharp sell-off. The stock is on track for its third straight negative session. By the way, it has dropped 12% over the 3-day slide, putting it past the 10% threshold that represents a correction. Again, Nvidia right now lower by 4.7%. So again, recapping, U.S. stocks are trading mixed. S&P up 16, up 0.3%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. And welcome to the Monday edition. It feels like a Monday. Certainly for some of us, had a couple days off last week. On Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, it is the fastest show in politics. We always keep our eyes on the markets for you with the help of Charlie Pellet in New York. So yes, once more, under the breach, dear friends. As I read in the chat here, everyone's girding for my return today. Producer Matt Shirley, thank you. Producer James Mahoney, back in the saddle as well. And big thanks to Kaylee Lyons for manning the fort last week. Quite a weekend, if you were following political news. If not, we'll take care of that for you. And it's a big day as both Joe Biden and Donald Trump prepare for the throwdown on Thursday night, because certainly the issue that we're discussing on this second anniversary of the end of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision, will be playing into the talking points that they are going to be using later on this week. It's become a massive issue on the campaign trail. We saw it play out in the midterms. We've seen it play out in specials along the way. And it's kind of the unquantifiable, right? We know the border is going to play big. We know the economy is. It's difficult to tell what this issue of abortion will do on the campaign trail. The Biden campaign thinks it knows. That's why Kamala Harris is dispatched to handle this entire issue in the throes of this campaign. And so we're going to spend some time this hour on this. What we've learned over the past couple of years, what we've seen happen in the wake of this ruling. We'll be talking in a moment with Carol Sanger from Columbia University, who specializes in reproductive rights. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has been on this quite a bit as well from the perspective of data. What's the baseline? What actually changed after the Supreme Court ruled that way? And I'm glad to say that Tyler's at the table with us now. Welcome to Monday. This is going to be an interesting one today as we kind of bring our heads back to where we were 2 years ago. I was in front of the court in what I think was 100-degree weather, kind of like you're going to have later on when you're down there. And there was a lot of anger and a lot of confusion. 2 years have passed, though, Tyler, and this is now up to the states. So what have the states done?
Exactly. So now, once Roe was overturned and there's no longer that constitutional protection, the states can either protect or restrict abortion access. And so far, 14 states have enacted near total abortion bans or no longer have abortion care available. An additional 3 have 6-week bans into place, commonly known as heartbeat bills, as you'll recall, and that's considered pretty restrictive policy. But despite all these bans, abortions are actually on the rise in the U.S. The Guttmacher Institute, that's an organization that tracks abortion care and is widely cited, they found abortions actually crossed the 1 million mark last year for the first time in over a decade. And of course, 2023 was the first full year on record since Roe was overturned. But when we really try to dig into the data, look at the patterns and the trend, one interesting one that's emerging is that more people are now traveling farther for abortion since Roe was overturned. So last year in 2023, 1 in 5 people had to cross state lines. That was about double the amount before Roe was overturned. For example, 1 in 10 people in 2020 had to cross state lines for abortions.
That's incredible. So that's the only way you get to that million mark that you mentioned. So clamping down on abortion in some states has done nothing to lower the number of abortions. It's simply caused women to travel is the takeaway.
Right. So people have to now travel for access, try to learn what is essentially now a patchwork of laws across the U.S. And we're expecting more to go on the books come November. So there has been this big push for state ballot initiatives to help define the laws in certain states. So far, we know 4 states have confirmed they will have constitutional amendments on the ballot come November that would protect or enshrine abortion access. This includes in Florida, which is one of the states that has enacted a 6-week heartbeat bill ban.
How many states do we have now with ballot initiatives?
So far, 4.
4.
But there could be more. We know that 6 others are currently trying to gather enough signatures to get this language on to the ballot. Again, these different initiatives will do different things. They could either enshrine abortion rights completely or perhaps, move that marker in abortion. For example, it would move it from 6 weeks to 24 weeks. But a new story out today on the Terminal looks at how initiatives that would actually restrict abortion access actually aren't gaining as much steam as those that would protect them. And we know that abortion is becoming a motivating factor, like you alluded to. Come November, we're expecting both candidates to address it on the stage on Thursday. You'll recall just last year, an off-cycle year, Ohio actually saw a record turnout for one ballot initiative, Issue 1, where Ohio voters, where of course there's that critical Senate race this year, they turned out in record numbers to protect abortion access.
So there's been test after test, and in each case, we've seen the progressive view win at the ballot box on this, if I can call it that. It does seem to cut pretty hard left and right when it comes to. And that great piece that you talked about, it's really good reporting on the Terminal. A KFF poll that we point out to, 53% of women Democrats in states with potential abortion ballot initiatives are, quote, more motivated to vote in the presidential election, more likely than Democratic women in other states to say they're voting for Joe Biden. So in those 4 states, when we're together on election night, we'll be looking closely at the motivating factor here, and I guess the turnout that may or may not materialize for Joe Biden.
Right, and another critical poll in that piece shows that 63% of Americans are in favor of some sort of protection to ensure that abortion can stay legal. So that kind of looks at the picture more broadly. I was speaking to a Republican strategist about this, and this idea that maybe we could see both parties framing abortion as a more health care issue. We saw this come up, of course, you remember State of the Union when IVF, after that critical Alabama Supreme Court ruling, and how we saw, the Republican Party trying to coalesce around a position saying that they were in favor of IVF protection. So this idea of abortion as a broader health care issue is something I think we're going to see on the campaign trail.
And of course, that was the night Joe Biden didn't want to use the word abortion. He was talking about it as a health care issue. Isn't that incredible? You see two sides sometimes come together in terms of the rhetoric. Tyler, great to have you back. Good luck with your reporting today. And Tyler will be with us in the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. Washington time, reporting for us every day here in Washington. I'm Joe Matthew. As we add the voice of Carol Sanger, as we mentioned, Barbara Ehrenstein, Black Professor Emerita of Law at Columbia University Law School, also author of About Abortion, Terminating Pregnancy in the 21st Century. This is an influential voice on reproductive rights from a legal perspective. And Carol, we welcome you back to Bloomberg. It's great to see you here. As we consider where we are 2 years later, we were just talking to Tyler about the way states have acted now in this new legal world that we are in. Are you surprised it's only 14 that we're talking about? What did you expect to happen 2 years ago when this ruling hit?
Well, I am laughing to myself because I was thinking about 2 years ago, there was a lot of talk about the post-Roe era. And now it's clearly, and now that term is used much less, and it's now the Dobbs era. So there's been there was a reluctance to get rid of even using Roe in advocacy, but now it's really the Dobbs era. And I was thinking maybe we could get some mileage out of Taylor Swift's eras that she has, thinking about how we talk about it, because crowning Dobbs with the imprimatur of stating what abortion is all about is really problematic. And so when you ask me what I think has changed in the last, or what I was expecting to have changed, I am surprised that there is as much positivity as there is. I thought it would be a deluge of pro-choice activity, and instead, and your last speaker I heard was talking about the use of referendum and initiatives in states. And so one of the things that's changed has been a sort of a lack of fear of all the state legislatures simply enacting more and harsher abortion restrictions. But in fact, there's been a real movement towards what some people call direct democracy, which is citizens themselves figuring out what they want the law to be. And that's been demonstrated in a number of not every state that puts something on the ballot or tries to gets it. For example, Maine couldn't do it, Louisiana couldn't do it, Wisconsin couldn't do it, but we've got a hefty number of states who are trying to, as people say, enshrine or include as part of the state constitutional governance the right to have an abortion. I think this is what Biden means when he says, I'm going to fight for you to get Roe v. Wade. He means the legal access nationwide to abortion. And one of the reasons it's so important is, as I think might have just been mentioned, the idea that this will get women out. I think it's very interesting that women are proving to be very powerful, not just in getting these referendums signed up, but having people come out to vote in general. And that's really, excuse me.
Well, I want to ask you about the referendums that you referred to, Carol, before we move on. Why is it that pro-choice activists are having an easier time getting on the ballot than pro-life activists?
Yeah, because they are making arguments that are reframing abortion away from the idea of this is murder and we need this to prevent women from murdering their babies, and ending their pregnancies. And they're framing it in terms of the positive value that being pregnant can have, or trying to get pregnant can have, for women who, by virtue of, the best example is in vitro fertilization. So you want to have a baby. You don't want to have an abortion. You want to have a baby. But to do that, you may have to have multiple embryos, and some of them may have to be disposed of if you have the number of the successful implants that you want. And so it's changed how people think about abortion as from being something wicked, which is what the right has worked on for so long, to, get us used to the idea that abortion is murder and nothing less. And now it's been transformed into, well, abortion also can facilitate having your own family, which many people want. So I think that's part of why this is a difference from previous years. That abortion is seen as part of a toolkit of fertility, and that it can't just be struck out of hand as something wicked and obscene. So that's I think my best answer to your question, that we have a new way
Carol,
of looking
Tyler
at
was
abortion.
talking with us. I understand that rhetoric is changing under our feet, and that changes the way people look at things. Tyler was talking with us about the amount of travel that so many women have found themselves doing here in the wake of this ruling. Even as the number of abortions has increased, we're seeing people cross state lines. And I wonder, to that end, when we think about the Supreme Court's ruling recently on mifepristone, to what extent is mifepristone or similar mail order abortion pills, to what extent are they available to women who live in states that have banned abortion?
Well, we don't entirely know the answer to that. And there are a couple of attacks on mifepristone that are lying in wait and that we have to consider. But I wanted to, on what you just said, I wanted to say about traveling. In 2016 was when we had our last positive, good for women abortion case at the Supreme Court. And it was a Texas case where Texas had a burden getting an abortion. You could only get it from doctors who had admitting privileges. You could only get it if your abortion clinic had as good as facilities as a operating room. And the Supreme Court then said, no way. They turned that, they struck the Texas law down. And what I thought was really interesting was, I copied this out. They said, when we look at what this law is really doing, it's making women travel. It's making them travel. It's making them spend money. It's taking their valuable time, whether at work or as parents. And it says, in the face of no threat to women's health, Texas forces long distances to get women to get abortions in crammed to capacity super facilities. And this does not give them the individual attention, the serious consideration, or the emotional support they need. And the reason that was such the decision was called Whole Women's Health. And the reason that was such a good decision was it treated women as medical patients, not as would-be murderers. And it said what we want for people who need medical care is good, not crammed and over capacity facilities. So that was only 2016. And now that is not as secure as it was then. The other thing I'd say that I just want
Carol,
to emphasize.
I'm sorry. I wish I had more time to continue this conversation, and I hope that we'll be able to hear on Bloomberg from Columbia University Law School, Carol Sanger, with us on this 2-year anniversary of the end of Roe v. Wade. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll have a lot more ahead as we turn our attention to the campaign trail, not just this issue, but the others resonating Thursday night in the debate. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P. They're both advancing right now. NASDAQ, though, in the red. NVIDIA weighing on NASDAQ. NVIDIA shares, they are down 4.5%. Right now, the S&P is up 16, up 0.3%. The Dow up 345, up 0.9%. While the NASDAQ Composite Index down 40, a drop there of 0.3%. Again, NVIDIA, worth repeating, slumping now by 4.6%. 10-year, 4.26%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.74%. Gold up 0.3%, 23.29 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, 81.55 a barrel. Prosecutors have reportedly recommended to senior Justice Department officials that Boeing face criminal charges for violating a settlement relating to 2 fatal crashes. This, according to Reuters. The people did not specify what criminal charges Justice Department officials are considering. Reuters shares up now by 1.9%. Again, recapping, it is a mixed Monday. The Dow, the S&P, they are both higher. NASDAQ in the red. NVIDIA down now by 4.7%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. You think NVIDIA will come up at the debate on Thursday night? I mean, it's inevitable, right? Not really. But AI could be among the things that are talked about. I'm really curious. We talked so much about what the candidates are going to do or not do. I'm curious what the moderators are going to do with their time, what kind of questions they get in here. And, of course, what form it takes once the candidates start talking. You know, the mics are going to be cut off. We've got all kinds of rules that they've plugged in here for this thing. It's going to be on CNN, but you watch it right here on Bloomberg. For the voices you trust, we'll have all of the analysis that you would expect here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Joe Biden's at Camp David right now, huh? He's already there. Beautiful this time of year. Press can't get to you. Nobody can. You know, when you walk away from your desk when you're at work, you got to do something. You find a conference room, you hunker down, so no distractions. That's the deal for Joe Biden. Donald Trump appears to be just being Donald Trump. He was riffing over the weekend, held a couple of rallies, talked to people out there, says he's already made up his mind on a vice president. Helping us put it all together, Bloomberg's Laura Davison with us here at the table on a Monday. This is a big week.
This is a huge week. It could be, you know, just on the docket.
Yeah.
We have potentially a VP pick from Trump. We have the debate and also the immunity decision, a presidential immunity from the Supreme Court. So all of that.
By the way, all that could happen the same day, never mind the same week. Are you like, you must be feeding the troops Wheaties for this one, because Thursday morning the building's going to shake, potentially a Supreme Court ruling on immunity, right? And we're going to end the day with this debate. We haven't even gotten to sentencing yet, but let's deal with this week as a whole. Everyone's making a big deal about the difference in the style of these two, the way they're preparing. Do we actually have a sense of what Donald Trump is doing other than kind of riffing with his advisors?
Well, tonight he's at a fundraiser in New Orleans with Steve Scalise. So, you know, he'll be speaking to...
That's not debate prep.
Business executives, but he really doesn't like debate prep. He doesn't, you know, he doesn't like sort of the structure of that, you know, the cramming for the test. He's having what he's calling policy time, where he's sitting down with aides, just sort of riffing on policy, going over some key talking points, but nothing, you know, there's not going to be binders of, you know...
Or mock debates with, say, podium setup. That's what's going on at Camp David, right?
No, and the way he treats, I mean, it's kind of like how he preps for his rallies. You know, there are sort of prepared remarks that his team puts together, and then he just talks in between those. But, you know, even going into the debate room, all candidates can have is pen and paper and water. They can't even take notes in. So it'll be totally freeform once
now,
he gets
so
in there.
Just so I understand, we're going to have commercials in this thing, which does feel kind of hokey to me for what would normally have been, you know, a commission-sanctioned general election debate. There's something kind of holier than now about it. This is a CNN debate with your favorite moderators and commercials that everyone will need to run when they carry the debate. The two candidates cannot confer with staff during those breaks, correct?
Correct. This is basically just a break for them. Part of this is, you know, they can say, oh, look, this is CNN. They want the commercial break for the ad revenue. But the candidates are also probably not saying no to having a little couple-minute break, you know, built into, you know, a 90-minute debate. Which,
can they leave the stage?
You know, I'm not totally sure on that, but they're not allowed to talk to anyone. So, you know, they can, you know.
We need break cams that just follow them everywhere they go, you know, that we can see them while we're in commercial.
We will have photographers in there for, you know, a pool spray, you know, basically where they all get to just take photos of the candidates. So we will have, you know, eyeballs in the room on what's happening.
What do you know about spin rooms here? I've heard that Gavin Newsom's going to be there for Joe Biden, and you'll have Don Jr. and any number of folks who want to be vice president for Donald Trump. Is that the expectation?
Yes, yeah. So they will have the spin room. There will be reporters on the ground doing the normal thing, but it's going to be a weird debate because there isn't going to be that TV audience.
Right.
There aren't going to be all the people streaming into the the auditorium like we've had before. In their gear. This is just going to be very subdued, almost anticlimactic in a certain way.
Well, then of course the fireworks could pop off at any point. So really interesting. I took some notes from Donald Trump's comments over the weekend on some of these. The one on Saturday, he was speaking in an event in Philadelphia to conservative Christians, in which he floated this idea of having migrants who cross the border illegally join an ultimate fighting league and have them be pitted against the current extreme fighting champions here, like we're going to reopen the Coliseum somewhere down on the border. He says, did anyone ever hear of Dana White? This is like the big tough guy who runs the UFC. They checked with Dana White. He actually had that conversation with Donald Trump.
It was a really interesting, when Trump talks, he is, saying, he says what's on his mind. He mentioned this conversation. Dana White was asked about it just later that night, and he said, well, it was a joke, but yeah, he said it. And that's how you see business leaders doing, members of Congress doing, oh, yes, Trump is saying that, but of course he doesn't mean it. But
doesn't he?
He does. A lot of times he says what he's thinking.
This is pretty scary stuff. At a post-fight news conference in Saudi Arabia, White confirmed Trump made the comments but said they were a joke. I saw everyone going crazy online, he said, but yeah, he did say it. We heard from the communications director from the Trump campaign because a lot of people were frankly outraged by what they saw as a very racist idea. These elitists, quote, are the same people who stupidly think combat sports is human cockfighting, showing their ignorance to the sweet science of mixed martial arts. Stephen Chung, the comms director, the Trump campaign. That's how we're going to play this? Does anyone even remember this the day after?
You know what? In a week like this, probably not. This will be the thing that will flip by, and we'll have many more of these. In the next 5 months. Until we hit the election.
Right. I guess this isn't going to happen. Are you a mixed martial arts fan? The sweet science.
I will admit to not knowing much about mixed martial arts, but I think that all of this would be a liability for the sport.
So, all right, let me throw a few more logs on the fire. The late great Hannibal Lecter, we've been hearing a lot about lately. Sharks, right? You want to stay in the boat or swim with the sharks. Of course, the election rigged in 2020. Donald Trump says the fake news will say Trump is rambling. No, it's genius what I'm doing up here. It's just that nobody understands. I'm trying to figure out who's right on that.
What's interesting is, he is entertaining when he tells the story about, the electric battery and the boat is sinking and there's a shark, and do you jump out and get eaten by the shark, or do you stay in and get electrocuted? It's amusing to listen to, of course.
But that was 2016.
That was 2016.
That's when everybody was laughing.
But even now, you go to these rallies and he does have people showing up. They're excited to be there. They're laughing. They're cheering. But it plays a lot differently when he, was in Washington a week or two ago speaking with corporate executives who were kind of walked out of that being like, oh, that, do we want that again? Yeah. He did talk about, he has gotten better about calibrating his message to his audience. So when he's in front of, Senate Republicans, he was very subdued of, we're going to be unified. He's a little bit more raucous when he was in front of House Republicans. So he is picking up on that, but at the core, he's out there doing rallies once or twice a week, speaking off the cuff with all sorts of, what a lot of people deem as sort of crazy stuff.
Well, and it's, look, the tip sheets are starting to compile these when you read in the morning what's going on in the world. The Biden campaign is starting to compile these videos now, or the sort of the Lincoln Project, the liberal social media clippers. You're seeing montages of Donald Trump saying crazy things to compete with these montages of Joe Biden looking old, right? This is kind of where we are now. And I wonder if anyone even watches that debate Thursday night, or if the whole thing plays out in clips and memes on social media the next day.
It's almost certainly the second. A 90-minute debate. It's like State of the Union. That it's a long thing. A lot of people aren't home. Nobody, even on.
So you and I are the only people watching this.
We're watching. Well, and then people may, if they're really interested, read a story about it. But most people are going to be sitting there on TikTok, on Instagram, and looking at that 30-second bit of the fly falling on Mike Pence's head versus any sort of substantive policy discussion, which I do think will probably be on the lighter side.
Reinforcing the nothing matters kind of world that we're in politics here. That also, though, goads the candidate to have a viral moment, right? That could mean we have more crazy than less in this debate.
It certainly could. And one thing that's interesting is that the Democrats have realized that they are losing the TikTok game. There are just more conservative content creators on TikTok. Trump content does a lot better on TikTok than Biden content. So they need to come up with a way to reach those young voters, which polls show they're struggling to have the same sort of margin.
I didn't know that. Is it Trump? It's like Joe Biden's not good on TikTok, or this is a Republican, Democratic, conservative, liberal thing?
It's just partially who's on the platform of which groups are there and who's listening.
And TikTok leans right.
TikTok leans right in terms of the content creators. Who's on there is a little bit harder to tell, but it certainly skews young, which you would assume that more left-leaning content would do better. But here's the split we see, and this may explain a little bit why younger voters are more open to voting for Trump than they were 4 and 8 years ago.
Fascinating. This is why you hit up Laura Davison in the newsroom if you want to know what's going on. Great to have you back, as always. This is the week of weeks. We had to start things off with Laura. It'll be her team cranking on that debate when the headlines are flying on Thursday night, or we'll see, maybe 10 o'clock in the morning with the Supreme Court. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We've got a lot to go through together this week, and I'm glad you're with us here. We've got the panel next for their take on all of it. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are on the way in next. After we update world and national news, we'll do that now with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. The Supreme Court is stepping into the fight over transgender rights, agreeing to hear appeals from the Biden administration and families seeking to block state bans on gender-affirming care. Emory University law professor Fred Smith says it's kind of unusual because the U.S. government has decided to intervene in family lawsuits against a state.
It's the United States that has asked the Supreme Court to intervene, and that's not particularly common. And so it really does suggest that from the perspective of the federal government, that they view this as an issue where it's important to have a clear resolution.
Emory University law professor Fred Smith. The court will hear arguments in the case this fall. A high-ranking banker on Wall Street has resigned after this incident went viral. A 10-second clip on X showing a man throwing a punch at a woman in a Brooklyn's Park Slope neighborhood. A police report shows that man is Jonathan Kay, head of the Global Business Services franchise at Moelis & Company. Kay was placed on leave shortly after that incident. Now, media reports say it happened during a fight over Israel's actions in Gaza, and a police report states the woman suffered a broken nose, lacerations, a black eye, and she lost consciousness. A Moelis spokesperson says Kay has resigned, and his profile was taken off the bank's website. Former President Donald Trump's attorneys are arguing the classified document case against Trump down in Florida should be dismissed because the prosecutor was wrongly appointed. Legal experts say it's a long shot. That claims the Senate should have approved the appointment of special counsel Jack Smith. Now, during Friday's hearing, District Judge Eileen Cannon seemed skeptical, but that was just the first of 5 hearings that she scheduled over several days, including today and tomorrow. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got a decidedly mixed market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up by 0.9% right now. S&P higher by 16, up by 0.3%, while NASDAQ is down 46, a drop there of 0.3%. A renewed bout of volatility is gripping stocks as a plunge in NVIDIA raises speculation that the rally in the industry that has powered the bull market is due for a breather. NVIDIA shares down now by 4.5%. 10-year yield at 4.26%, the 2-year 4.73%. Gold up $9 the ounce, up 0.4%, $23.31 on gold, while West Texas Intermediate crude now up 1.1%, WTI 81.63 a barrel. As for the economic backdrop and the Fed rate cut outlook, Robert Socken is with Citigroup Global Markets.
I think you can still get to a September rate cut, even if you don't get the sharper downturn that our U.S. team has in its forecast. We're expecting just 0.15% for core PCE on Friday. Very important print this week. And I think if you continue to get market progress on inflation, even if the economy holds up well, the Fed probably by September is likely to conclude they've made enough progress to start easing rates.
Robert Socken of Citigroup. It is another tough day for auto dealers across America. At least 4 publicly traded auto dealers have warned the SEC in coming days that they could see a possible financial impact from that cyber attack last week that stalled service at car dealerships across the U.S. and Canada. Among those publicly traded auto dealerships, Sonic Automotive up today by 1.9%. Group 1 Automotive up 2%, AutoNation down 0.3%, Lithia Motors up by 1.4%. Again, recapping, S&P higher by 13, up 0.3%, NVIDIA down 4.8%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can always join us. Search Bloomberg Global News. You'll find our live stream there, and we'll meet you in the studio with a remarkable headline. This is something that would have been big news a couple of months back when the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed in Baltimore. 8:30 this morning, the 984-foot dolly started moving out of the harbor, heading out of Baltimore for Virginia, putting somewhat of an emotional marker on this thing. It's going to take years, of course, to rebuild that bridge. But to see this 3 months after it lost power and crashed into one of the bridge's supporting columns, causing that bridge to collapse, pretty remarkable to see it sailing out of Baltimore Harbor. We'll call that a win today. As we consider the Senate race in the state of Maryland, one that could determine the balance of power in the U.S. Senate, one we've talked about a lot here, and we actually spent some time talking to Wes Moore about just a couple of weeks back, the governor of Maryland, who is supporting the Democrat Angela Alsobrooks in her race for Senate against the former governor Larry Hogan, knowing that Larry Hogan and Wes Moore had a pretty darn good relationship for a D and an R. And it's something with new polling out today that we're going to talk about next with our panel. It's something that we discussed with Wes Moore when he joined Kaylee Lyons and I here on this program. Kaylee asked him about that Senate race in Maryland. Here's what he said.
There are also down ballot races in the state of Maryland we are watching, including for the Senate. You, of course, backed Angela Alsobrooks in her Democratic primary campaign against Congressman David Trone. She won. She is now up against your predecessor, Larry Hogan, who left the governorship with 77% approval. And sir, you yourself were a pretty popular governor, but that approval is even higher than yours. Can you confidently say there is not a risk that Larry Hogan can be the one that flips a blue Senate seat red?
Well, I think there's absolutely a risk, but I think it's also why we're taking it seriously, because what the real risk is that that the state of Maryland is not going to give the Senate majority to the Republicans, not in this moment. And I also think there's disparity in the differences between these two candidates is also very real. where, you know, we have the county executive, the person I supported very early in this race, and I'm excited to support her through the election, through the general election, where she has a very clear history of being able to fight for reproductive health care and reproductive rights. And we know that the old governor does not. In fact, vetoed legislation to support privacy, vetoed legislation to support additional protections. I had to, on my first day of office, I released $3.5 million of funds that the old governor previously withheld because he did not want to release that money due to political reasons. That we have a candidate in Angela Alsobrooks who, while she was county executive, saw a significant drop in violent crime in Prince George's County versus, you know, the old governor saw significant increases in violence and homicides during his time as governor. So it's going to be an important and spirited race. I think the county executive is going to win because I think these issues that we are going to see, people understand that there's a track record that has to be examined.
You've had some good things to say in the past, Governor, about Larry Hogan. I know you're a gentleman, and that should not be outside of the realm, but you called him a capable leader with a strong record. He's using your words in some of his ads. But I'm also taken by what Larry Hogan said about you. In a conversation with Maryland Matters, I believe it was, shortly after you won the governorship, quote, "I really like him," he said. "Seems like a genuinely nice, likable guy who seems to really want to make a difference and seems to be in it for the right reasons." He said that about you, Governor. Are you sure you guys are on opposite sides?
No, and what I tell people, I don't have a problem, you know, with him personally at all. I also know that my support of Angela Alsobrooks is not because of personality. It's because she matches the values, not just of me, but the values of the state. And I know what's on the line. Okay. I know that having a Republican Senate majority is on the line. I know that making sure that Maryland can be a safe haven for abortion rights is on the line. I know making sure that we can actually provide supports to make our communities safer and more affordable is on the line. And so I have nothing bad to say personally about the old governor. I also just know that when I think about who I want as a partner inside the U.S. Senate, it's Angela Alsobrooks.
Did he call him the old governor? I missed that the first time around. Wes Moore, the new and young governor of Maryland, speaking with us a couple of weeks ago here on Balance of Power. Enter public policy polling out today with new numbers on the race. We'll see what the panel thinks of this. Our new Maryland poll finds Angela Alsobrooks leading Larry Hogan 45-34. Similar spread we found on our last poll. And interestingly, there's so much talk about favorables here. Wouldn't be too worried if you were Angela Alsobrooks reading this poll. This is where we start our conversation with Rick and Jeannie. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. They're both here right now. Jeannie, it's great to see you. Of course, you are also Senior Democracy Fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency in Congress. You're also a pollster. Does this paint the real picture of what's happening in Maryland?
I think it does. This is in keeping with, I think, what many of us expected. You mentioned her popularity or favorable ratings. They are 10, plus 10. And so they are better than Larry Hogan's, although he remains a very popular former governor. The problem for Larry Hogan is that it is really, really tough in a state that the incumbent president won by as big a margin as Joe Biden won the state for you to get elected. And in fact, it's becoming increasingly difficult. I was just looking at these numbers. In 2000, we saw 10 ticket splitters, you know, Senate races and presidential elections where you would get a president of one party and a Senate candidate of another party would win. After Donald Trump in 2016, we've only seen that once in 2020, and that was in Maine with Susan Collins. So the likelihood he could do this, it's a really uphill battle historically.
Rick Davis, we've talked a lot about the favorables here for Larry Hogan. Super popular governor when he left. If there's one Republican who could do it, it would be him, I think is the idea. This poll finds, as they write, for all the talk of Hogan's popularity, Alsobrooks is actually more popular. She has a plus 27 favorability rating compared to his plus 17. How do you rationalize those numbers?
Yeah, it's really easy. I mean, it's not apples to apples. Hogan has 100% name ID, statewide elected office holder for a long time, very well known, and as you point out, very well liked. Alsobrooks has about half of that is the name ID. So she's only being evaluated by half the state, and they like what they see. I mean, she's 10% more than Larry Hogan, but only half the people can identify her. So the reality is the biggest thing that's going to happen in this election is the defining of Angela also Brooks. I mean, like, she's going to go out there and tell everybody why everyone wants to like her. And Larry Hogan and the Republicans are going to go out there and tell you why you shouldn't like her. And that number will change. If the election were today, half the state would be scratching her head wondering who she is. So she's going to get defined. And the question is she defined in a positive way or a negative way?
Well, we're talking Maryland. Jeannie, Kamala Harris tweets, Maryland, I'm headed your way to mark the anniversary of Donald Trump's hand-picked Supreme Court justices overturning Roe v. Wade. That would be today, of course, the 2-year anniversary. And it's something we started this hour talking about. Obviously, Maryland is not going to be necessarily the battleground on this issue, or is it? Why the venue today as Kamala Harris continues to own this issue for the campaign and for the administration?
Yeah, speaking today at the University of Maryland, and of course for Democrats, this is a really, really important seat. If Larry Hogan was to take this, I think we'd be asking ourselves, how big is the Republicans' margin in the Senate, as opposed to the other way around? So they feel this is a must-hold seat. Larry Hogan has been challenged by the fact that Donald Trump came out and openly endorsed him. Normally, that would probably be a good thing to have the presumptive nominee endorse you. Not in the case of Larry Hogan in the state of Maryland, where again, Joe Biden has a double-digit lead and won the state by double digits. So Kamala Harris, the first gentleman, the first lady, all out in the last few days on this anniversary, not necessarily celebrating it, but talking about how dangerous it would be for women's health and health care if Donald Trump was to be reelected. And she's going to make this case, or is making this case today in the state of Maryland, where there is a, enormous growth in terms of women voters and others who care about this issue, who are saying they may go out on it in larger numbers than we've ever seen in American history.
Can either candidate, Rick, move the needle on this issue in the debate? I'm assuming that this will come up, if not once, more than once, from different angles as the moderators work their way through 90 minutes of questioning. But everyone knows where Joe Biden is on this. There's a little more gray area with Donald Trump.
Yeah, Donald Trump has more flexibility. Joe Biden, he has a Democratic doctrinaire policy of abortion that's pretty well articulated, and he'll just re-articulate that, right? I don't think you would expect anything new from Joe Biden on abortion. Donald Trump is kind of all over the map, right? I mean, like, he takes credit for having appointed the Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe. So in certain audiences, he sounds downright conservative when it comes to abortion. But then on his own, he says, well, it really ought to be just up to the states. Let the states decide. And even critical of some of the states like Florida that have, passed laws that restrict abortion to, I think, 6 weeks. So the reality is that's a question. Where's Donald Trump going to be on abortion debate night? Because he's going to get asked, and he's got a lot of different variations of his own position. Which one will he pick for the CNN debate?
Yeah, how true. Even Donald Trump has said himself, Jeannie, we've discussed this, that this is a bad issue for suburban women. Will he be speaking to them on Thursday night?
He really does need to. And to Rick's point, I think somebody calculated 15 positions he's taken publicly since he has come into politics on the issue of abortion alone. The reality for Donald Trump is he owns what these states are doing. He himself has been critical. Florida, Rick mentioned, also Arizona. But the reality is he owns this. And in talking to Christians this weekend, he took credit on the one hand for returning this issue to the states, but he also wants to run away from what the states are doing with this. And that has proven not to be a winning message, and he knows it. So the more on Thursday night they're talking about abortion, the worse for Donald Trump. This isn't an issue that is good for him. He'd rather stick to inflation, the economy, and immigration if he had his choice.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. I wonder how many variations we're going to get on these themes and exactly how they use the time, to your point. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature panel, back together on this Monday. This is going to be a heck of a week, and we have more to talk about with Rick and Jeannie coming up in our second hour. As always, we'll get into a little bit more on this 2-year anniversary for Dobbs and what it means for the campaign trail. The Biden campaign already seizing on this with a new video today on Twitter. As we mentioned, Kamala Harris heading to Maryland to speak about this. So we've got much more to follow here, and an update on what's happening in Israel. Nick Wadhams will join us coming up at the top of our next hour from our national security team, and Spencer Kimball from Emerson Polling. A lot ahead right here on the fastest show in politics, only on Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Israel says intense fighting in Gaza will soon end, even as Benjamin Netanyahu at last rejects the idea of a permanent ceasefire with Hamas. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lines today in Washington. And Kaylee, we're now 1 month away from Netanyahu's visit to Washington.
And the tenor of that visit in his remarks to a joint session of Congress will probably be colored by what happens over the course of the next 4 weeks and whether or not that actually includes an opening of a new front in this war, no longer just fighting with Hamas in Gaza, but potentially fighting with Hezbollah more directly on the northern border with Lebanon.
Yeah, that northern border has been a bit of a war zone since October 7th. But the question, and we've been asking it every day here, Kaylee, for a couple of weeks now, will Israel essentially declare war against Hezbollah? And that's something we're going to talk about coming up with Nick Wadhams in an interesting conversation here that we'll be having as well with General McKenzie, now a retired general, Kenneth McKenzie, and his view on the future of the Middle East.
And of course, we'll be talking about how that foreign policy challenge, one of the many foreign policy challenges the U.S. is facing, is going to factor into the CNN presidential debate coming up on Thursday, and how both candidates are polling ahead of that event. So a lot is coming up this hour. First, though, as always, let's kick it off with a check on the markets from Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kaylee. And here's what's going on. We have got the Dow, the S&P, they're both higher. NASDAQ in the red. S&P 500 holding on to its gains even as NVIDIA falls. NVIDIA right now down 5.2%. S&P up 8, up 0.1%. The Dow up 305, up 0.8%. While NASDAQ is slumping 89 points, down by about 0.5%. 10-year at 4.26%. The 2-year 4.74%. Gold up $10 the ounce to $23.31, up 0.4%. While West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 1.1%. WTI 81.65 a barrel right now. Alnylam pharmaceutical shares are soaring 34% after its drug succeeded in treating a progressive and deadly form of heart disease, potentially opening up a new avenue for the company's top-selling product. Again, we've got Alnylam up now by 34%. And just getting word that Paramount Global is raising the price of its streaming service, all part of a push by the TV and film giant to stem losses in its online business. Paramount right now up by 0.9%. So again, recapping, a down day for NVIDIA as it moves into correction territory, down 5.2%. S&P now holding on to a 7-point gain, up 0.1%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York, thank you so much. I am Kaylee alongside Joe here in Washington, where we're trying to dissect the messaging we're getting out of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It was over this weekend, Joe, that he gave an interview to Israeli media in which he seemed to just reject the prospect of the ceasefire deal with Hamas that was laid out by President Biden at the end of May. To the Knesset today, though, it seems that he has made an attempt to try to walk it back, telling them in part, we are committed to the Israeli proposal that President Biden welcomed. Our position has not changed.
Okay. We've heard that before, though, as well, and their position being not until the end of Hamas, and it's pretty difficult to tell when, if ever, that will happen in Gaza. We saw a lot more fighting in Gaza City over the weekend. And you're right, every time Benjamin Netanyahu does an interview, the ground seems to shift under the Biden administration here.
Yeah, and it raises the question of what is being targeted perhaps in an Israeli audience. Again, this was Israeli media versus, say, the English video he put out on social media last week talking about American weapons shipments to Israel. He does seem to be targeting these messages, and maybe that is one of the reasons why these messages could be read as a bit inconsistent.
Yeah, we turn to Nick Wadhams for some clarity here. Of course, runs our national security coverage in Washington, and with us at the table. Nick, it's great to have you back in the mix. What do you make of this? To Kaylee's point, it was May, that Friday in May, that Joe Biden rolled out the ceasefire proposal that had apparently been approved by Benjamin Netanyahu. It is now officially off the table. He said in this interview that he would only go for a temporary ceasefire and partial hostage release. Was there ever an actual deal?
I think that the answer to that is almost certainly no. There was never a deal. What you saw there, according to the sources we've been speaking to for the last several weeks, is this was essentially a gamble by the Biden administration where they laid out the terms of a deal where the devil was always going to be in the details. You had phase one, which was this temporary ceasefire, and then the possibility of a limited hostage release, moving to a phase two, which would be a more permanent ceasefire, and then phase three. And the question was always, how do you get from phase 1 to phase 2? And there was never any agreement on that because, and this is just the central tension that has been in this all along, is you have Israel saying they are not going to stop until Hamas is eradicated, Hamas saying they are not going to agree to a ceasefire unless they are left in power in Gaza. How do you reconcile those two things? You cannot. So I think you're really seeing an administration here that is finally perhaps coming to terms with the fact that this is a rock in a hard place. There is no solution here. Do they look for other means of leverage on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? But for the time being, this ceasefire proposal is pretty much not going anywhere.
Okay, so if a ceasefire is going nowhere, if a solution to Israel's Hamas issue is yet to be found, can Israel realistically be fighting a war simultaneously against Hamas and also with Hezbollah? How do they do both at the same time? Are they really going to?
Well, and that is something that the Biden administration has really been pressing the Israelis not to do for a long time. A lot of their diplomacy in the last several months has been against opening that second front precisely for that reason, both obviously the military pressure that it would put on Israel, but opening up this whole other conversation and source of tension with the rest of the region and then provoking the possibility of a much wider regional war, which would just create even more instability. I mean, it was notable that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government said, listen, the campaign against Hamas is winding down. It's almost sort of saying we see the end is in sight. Now we're turning to this issue of Hezbollah. So the Israelis seem implicitly to be recognizing that they can't do both at once, and they want to turn their attention to Hezbollah. I mean, this is a huge concern for the Biden administration right now. They really do not want this. They have a special envoy, Amos Hochstein, who has been dispatched to the region essentially to keep this from going on. But the question, as always, what leverage does Biden have over Prime Minister Netanyahu? It seems like a lot less.
Israel's defense minister is here now having this conversation with the White House, right? This video from Hezbollah Saturday night, pretty scary stuff, showing coordinates, displaying coordinates near a central Israeli airport, 2 power plants, a nuclear research center, a cargo port, and a gas field, implying they will bomb all of these installations if Israel declares war on Hezbollah. Is this confrontation seen as inevitable?
The administration does not think it is inevitable and feels that they can do what they did over the last couple months, which was head it off. And they also argue, you saw what Israel did in the face of that drone and missile barrage from Iran a few weeks ago, and maybe they would be able to do the same against Hezbollah. Very different situation, though, given how well supplied Hezbollah is. I mean, I think what you're seeing there almost is a messaging a game of chicken by Hezbollah, essentially saying, if you decide to do this, here's what you could see, which understandably is provoking a lot of concern, because for all of the opprobrium and the isolation that Israel has faced over its handling of the war in Gaza, in the region, a war against Hezbollah is going to make that go up exponentially, so they're going to have a real problem on their hands.
All right, Nick Wadhams, who leads Bloomberg's national security coverage here in Washington. Thank you so much. And of course, Joe, as Nick speaks to the idea that the Biden administration obviously has been dogged by this, pushing for a ceasefire, as this is a big political problem for the president. It also is influencing races down the ballot, including an important race that's happening in New York tomorrow, the primary against the incumbent Congressman Jamal Bowman up against George Latimer. And it's their policies toward Israel and Gaza that are really seeming to define this race.
Yep, big contrast. Bowman considered part of the squad, as we call it here, and I think we all know how the squad feels about Joe Biden's policies in Israel and in New York. It's a very interesting test. This is going to be one of several races we're watching on another primary day tomorrow.
Yeah, and we want to get more into it now with Spencer Kimball, who is joining us. He is executive director of the Emerson College Polling Center. They have been looking at this Democratic primary race in New York and found back on June 11th that Jamal Bowman is losing by 17 points to his challenger, George Latimer, 48-31. So, Spencer, welcome to Balance of Power. Thank you so much for being with us. Is all of this really going to come down to the Israel question?
Well, to some extent, Kaylee, because we asked the question about Israel, and it seemed like the district broke in the same manner as it did in the ballot test, with about a plus 20 in favor of more support with the Israelis. But it's a pressing question in the district. And as we know in primaries, it's all about turnout. So we'll see if Bowman's able to get out maybe more of the vote than what we expect.
Well, what does it look like here? Is this could be a difficult night for him? What does your polling show?
Yeah, we have Latimer up by 17 points. He was up about 48%. This was done a couple of weeks ago. There was about 21% that were undecided. So technically, you can see there's a range that Bowman could pick up some late support. You saw some rallies over the weekend. I think Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders was there, AOC. They did some back-to-back rallies. We'll see if that turns out a big turnout. But the early vote, the numbers we were looking at this morning, seems to be favoring Latimer a little bit as far as where that vote is coming from those, first couple of days.
Well, when we consider where the vote is coming from, it's also a question of the age of the voter, right? Spencer, I noticed in your polling, voters over 40 tend to break to Latimer, but Bowman is leading voters under 40. So does this really come down to that youth vote, if you will, and whether or not they show up tomorrow?
It will. And in this district, that youth vote is not as strong as in other parts of the country, even in other parts of New York City. So this is not going to be, we're not expecting an overwhelming youth turnout. If he's able to get one, we'll see if he can narrow that lead, particularly in the Bronx. But there's also going to be a very strong older vote. And that's what we normally see in these primaries. And that's where he struggles. He's trailing 2-1, 3-1 in that older vote. And, it looks like about 10,000 people voted early as well. We'll see how that vote breaks, because those will be some of those early numbers we see tomorrow night.
Well, Spencer, we want your take on the big debate this week from your perch at Emerson College Polling Center. I can only imagine the watch party in the Little Building on Thursday night. But based on history, should we expect to see a bump for one candidate or the other here? There's been a lot of talk about how it could be different this time as well, because a lot of folks won't hear anything about it till they go on Twitter the next day.
Well, we'll see. Traditionally, the first debate does not go well for the incumbent president. We've seen this historically with Ronald Reagan back in 1984. We see it with George Bush in 2004. So that even Barack Obama didn't have a good first debate. In fact, some people would say that it was Vice President Biden that helped him out in 2012 against Ryan. So that first debate's tough for the incumbent. It'll be interesting to see how President Biden handles that, if he's able to kind of buck the trend of that incumbency and is able to have a strong debate, considering how early this debate is in the cycle. Generally, these don't come out till September, and having this now in June puts a lot of pressure on both candidates because neither is technically their party's nominee. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any fallout from the debate.
Yeah, just presumptives sharing a stage on Thursday evening. It certainly is an interesting moment in history, Spencer. What will also be interesting is where they go after for the debate spin, the post-debate spin, rather. Despite all of our conversation that we have on this program and others like it across all of the networks about the swing states ultimately being the deciding factors, Donald Trump is going to spend Friday in Virginia, and Joe Biden's going to New York in New Jersey. Should we be expanding our swing state list?
Well, I do think we need to be looking at some other states that traditionally have voted mostly Democrat. For example, Minnesota. We've done a couple of polls out in Minnesota where we've had it very close to tied. And that's a state that we're keeping an eye on. We have not polled Virginia yet, but we have seen other polls out there that have that race close to tied as well. New York, I think, is an interesting example. We have it at 7 points. Our friends over at Siena have it at 8 points. That's a state where Biden wins by 23 points. And we'll see if those numbers hold or if Biden's able to get his base and be able to put that coalition back together.
So if you're standing at the corner of Boylston and Tremont, pulling people aside today, Spencer, and asking them about the guilty verdict, what are they going to tell you? And Is this going to come up on Thursday night?
Well, Joe, at Boylston and Tremont, the guilty is, there's a big party here. This is one of Biden's strongest, probably, corners of the country. But outside in the rest of the country, they're pretty much split on it. A plurality of voters, it didn't impact their vote. I think overall for that independent vote, and that's a key vote here because Biden's losing independents right now in these swing states, and he won them back in 2020, is that they find it less likely that they're going to support Trump because of it. It's a slight number there. It's about 3-1, and it's, again, a small percentage. But in a race that could come down to the margins, that issue overall seems to not be a benefit. But we'll see how far it goes, honestly, in the debate as well, how far Biden's pushing that message moving forward.
Well, does the polling suggest, Spencer, that there's another message he should be pushing that is more effective when we talk about those independent voters, the ultimately ones who will decide the outcome of this election? What message do they need to be targeted with?
Well, independents fall more with Republicans in that the economy is their top issue. For Democrats, there's more of a splattering of issues. Economy's up there, but so is healthcare and education, and a couple of, the environment would be a higher issue on the Democratic side. So talking about the economy will be important, but I think he's got an overarching message that he needs to get back to from 2020, which was his concept of a return to normalcy. And that's where the country, I think, is looking at and is a little weary at the moment. You see it in his approval numbers and when we ask if we're headed in the right or wrong direction. So looking at that vision of where the future is going to be over the next 4 years, if he was to be reelected, I think will be important for him to lay out. And to address the economy. The economy is a tough issue for him because more people see Trump as better on that topic. So he'll have to try to frame it in a way that he's at least able to compete with Trump because, as I mentioned, that is the top issue for those independent voters.
Sort of off-the-wall question for you, Spencer, before you leave us. We hear so much about how people like lying to pollsters now, that it's very difficult to get a quality sample because of so much distortion when you're picking up the phone and talking to people. What can you do as a pollster? What do you do to keep your respondents, to keep your survey honest?
Yeah, no, it's a challenge that we face in all these different modes of data collection. One thing that we try to avoid is having that, that interpersonal interaction where I'm calling someone. So we're text messaging. Okay. We're using emails and voice over, where your touch tone on your keypads. Mm-hmm. So you don't actually have to talk to a person, and you can take the surveys at your convenience, generally within 24 to 36 hours of receiving the message. So that is an issue that we look at within the industry, and something we'll continue to challenge.
A little peek behind the curtain there with Spencer Kimball. Absolutely. It's great to see you back here, Spencer, from Emerson College Polling, where he's the executive director. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons. We'll assemble our panel next. Rick and Jeannie are with us, the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 index now trading little changed, up by just 1 point. A couple of minutes ago, it was in the red. S&P, though, up now by less than 0.1%. We've got the Dow up 273, up 0.7%. NASDAQ down 114, a drop there of 0.6%. The big stock story today, NVIDIA. NVIDIA selling off again, down another 5.4%. 10-year, 4.25%, with a 2-year now yielding 4.73%. Gold up $9 the ounce, $23.31 on spot gold, up by about 0.4%, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.1%, $81.62 for a barrel of WTI. Apple's antitrust feud with the European Union over allegedly illegal practices on the App Store is intensifying as watchdogs issue a fresh warning that could lead to more fines just months after they slapped the iPhone maker with a $1.9 billion penalty for thwarting music streaming rivals. Apple up today by 1.3%. Recapping, S&P little change right now. S&P 500 index up by 0.5 point. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York with a look at today's Monday trading. Thank you so much. Of course, today, not just any Monday. It's the Monday that marks 2 years since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. The Dobbs decision came down 2 years today from the Supreme Court, in which the constitutional right to an abortion was overturned. Of course, many states have seen abortion bans go into place after that ruling. Others have 6-week bans in place. And this is becoming a campaign issue, especially so for the incumbent President Joe Biden, who is trying to point to abortion policy in a video today that he made to mark this 2-year mark.
Decades of progress shattered just because the last guy got 4 years in the White House. We know what will happen if he gets another 4. For MAGA Republicans, Roe is just the beginning. They're going to try to ban the right to choose nationwide. They're coming for IVF and birth control next. We're up against extremism. Send me back to the White House and I'll fight like hell to restore Roe v. Wade and protect American freedom.
Referring to the last guy, Joe Biden there, just a couple of days out, 4 days out from the presidential debate, as we assemble our panel for their take on all of this. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are together, our signature panel here. Jeannie is Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, along with Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie, this is surely going to come up in the debate on Thursday. I just wonder, as you look at this as a political scientist and a pollster 2 years later, if we can actually quantify the impact that abortion as an issue will have in this presidential campaign.
We've already seen an impact in elections since the Dobbs decision, and those have mostly favored those who are pro-choice. We haven't had a presidential election since Dobbs, so this is going to be a defining moment for all of us and everybody who cares about women's health care. But you look at the polls, you look at the turnout that has come about as a result, and you can have that quantification. And Donald Trump himself has said, GOP has not handled this well. It has been a losing issue for them for the most part. He knows this is not something that he wants to spend a lot of time on Thursday. He'd much rather talk about immigration and the economy, issues where in the polls at least, he is doing much better. So you can quantify it in those ways. Of course, I will just tell you, I go into the classroom every day, and there's very few Supreme Court cases you can call out by name and students respond to. But the idea that in 2 short years you can say Dobbs and everybody knows what you're talking about, I think just tells you how much that this is infiltrated, if you will, the popular conscience.
Well, and to Jeannie's point on how Donald Trump has been messaging around this, Rick, he has said, leave it to the states, that's essentially what the court, what the justices he appointed has done, give the power back to the states. He stands by whatever states ultimately are going to decide. Is that a message that is going to work in his favor, or is that just not a strong enough point to be making when so many voters say they're prioritizing abortion rights?
Well, it certainly works in his favor in the red states, right? And the country is almost evenly divided by state. So the first thing that happened was 14 states actually passed very restrictive laws. And then you got into all these other states that are now I think 7 states have already passed initiatives extending abortion rights. And we have now 9 on this ballot, 2024, that are going to attempt the same thing. So it's created a sort of political working class for abortion referendums since Dobbs. And in that regard, I would say it's a much more tenable position for Donald Trump to take, saying, hey, leave it up to the states, than what many of his fellow Republicans in Washington have been saying, which is, now that we've got this wind at our back on abortion, we should be trying to get a national abortion ban. In fact, he rolls into the convention in July, just a month away, with a plank in the platform left over from 2016 that calls for a constitutional amendment to ban abortion. So one of the things I'm watching is, will that be changed to let the states decide? Because that would certainly be more consistent with Trump, but also inflame the right to life community within the Republican Party.
Hard to believe we'll be in Milwaukee in just 3 weeks. Is that right? Wow. As we spend time with our panel, I want to get into some of the rhetoric that we heard over the weekend from Donald Trump specifically. He was in Philadelphia Saturday afternoon speaking to a group of Christian conservatives when he floated an idea. And I bring this up as part of kind of a composite of the wackier rhetoric that we've been hearing. We talked about Hannibal Lecter last week. In this case, the former president has a new idea on what to do with migrants who cross the border illegally. Let's listen together.
I have an idea for you to make a lot of money. You're going to go and start a new migrant fight league. Migrants, only migrants. And then at the end of the year, the champion migrant is going to fight your champion. And I hate to tell you, Dana, I think the migrant might win. That's how tough they are. This is not a normal situation.
Okay, this really happened. He's referring to Dana. That's Dana White, president of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC, who was contacted and said that, in fact, they did have this conversation. At a post-fight news conference in Saudi Arabia, White confirmed Trump made the comments, but said they were a joke. Rick, are we beyond this kind of thing mattering?
You know, I think we've been inoculated, right, to the point where it doesn't matter how crazy it is, that we kind of just say, oh, well, you know, that's just another Trump slogan. But I do think it plays against Trump in an electoral sense, which is it reminds everybody just how crazy that first administration he had was. The fatigue that people had at the end of it helped elect Joe Biden. And Biden's kind of lost that mojo. You know, he's not the stable guy anymore. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that they traded up in that regard. But Donald Trump's trying to remind them of just how crazy it can get. And I think this plays against him. I think he's got to get more on a mainstream track if he thinks that these independent voters especially are going to set aside their concerns about his craziness and, you know, vote on their economic self-interest.
Well, and as we consider how this messaging from Trump is actually reaching voters, if it is at all, Jeannie, we had to go cut that sound from a rally that took place in Pennsylvania, re-air it on this program. There's probably a lot of people out there who weren't paying attention to that one rally or the many others that have come before it, in which we've questioned things like sharks and boats and what have you. If there's more people tuning into a debate, though, is Thursday night a moment at which that could change, and what Donald Trump is saying off the cuff becomes much more embedded in the American conversation?
It can. I mean, a lot of that's going to depend on the size of the audience, and then to your point, how much gets cut and put out there and what resonates with people. But, you know, I thought that this remark over the weekend, he was talking, first of all, to a Christian group, and then he's in Philadelphia, and he is talking about human beings that are distressed and in some of the worst conditions you can ever imagine. And Dana White and Donald Trump suggested this is a joke. This is not a joke. These are people's lives. And what is Christian about this is nothing. And so to me, this comment, you know, he talked about Hannibal Lecter again. He talked about water, all kinds of things, sharks. But to describe human beings in this way, like you're going to put them into a cockfight, is so beyond the pale that I do hope people pay attention to what he's saying. And I would say, when you compare what he said this weekend on this to what Joe Biden has said, we have traded up, and many people think that, because this is unbecoming of any leader or any person, quite frankly. This is ugly, and it's distressing, and it's not funny.
Yeah, it does seem to cut through a little more than some of the other stuff, because we'll get tweets about Trump derangement syndrome and so forth because we brought this up. But the Steve Chung, the communications director for the Trump campaign, Rick, responded to some of the Democrat outrage. Quote, "These elitists are the same people who stupidly think combat sports is human cockfighting," to Jeannie's reference there, "showing their ignorance to the sweet science of mixed martial arts." Is that the right way to respond?
Well, first of all, I'd remind him that the sweet science is boxing that has actually been detrimentally affected by mixed martial arts. So he ought to get his slogan straight. But look, I mean, this is a popular, mixed martial arts is very popular in the United States. It's a huge billion-dollar industry, billions of dollars in industry, and it isn't illegal. It's supported by a lot of people. And frankly, this is one of the things that has been an advantage for Donald Trump, is the kind of nose turned up attitude that many people have toward what many people consider a sport at home. And you know, Lee Atwater used to describe professional wrestling as the only sport that isn't rigged, because of course it is rigged. And so, I mean, like, but it's fun for people to see. And so I do think this falls into the category, be careful what you say. It's kind of flyover communities that Hillary Clinton, spoke so disparagingly about in the 2016 race that lost her the election.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature political panel, thank you so much for joining us on this Monday as we look forward to the events of Thursday evening. Now let's get a check on world and national news. Amy Morris has that for us in the 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Kaylee. The Supreme Court is stepping into the fight over transgender rights, agreeing to hear appeals from the Biden administration and families seeking to block state bans on gender-affirming care. Emory University law professor Fred Smith says that's unusual because the U.S. government has decided to intervene in family lawsuits against a state.
It's the United States that has asked the Supreme Court to intervene, and that's not particularly common. And so it really does suggest that from the perspective of the federal government, that they view this as an issue where it's important to have a clear resolution.
Emory University law professor Fred Smith. The court will hear arguments in the case this fall. The Biden administration is announcing new steps to increase access to affordable housing as high interest rates have dramatically pushed up the cost of living in post-pandemic years. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is promoting these new investments while on a trip to Minneapolis. Now, these investments include providing $100 million through a new fund over the next 3 years to support affordable housing financing, boosting the federal financing bank's financing of affordable housing, and other measures. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Airbus has cut its annual delivery target to 770 jets from a previous goal of 800 jets, citing persistent supply chain issues. The European playmaker now expects adjusted earnings before interest and tax of 5.5 billion euros this year. That's down from a previous goal of as much as 7 billion euros. ADRs of Airbus down now by 4.5%. S&P 500 index, we'll call it flat on the day. Right now, little change. Was in the red just a couple of minutes ago. Right now, we've got the S&P flat. The Dow up 264, up 0.7. NASDAQ down 121, a decline there of 0.6%. NVIDIA very much in the red today, down again, down for a third day, dropping 5.4%. 10-year yield 5.25%. The 2-year 4.73%. Gold up $10 the ounce, up 0.5%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.1%, 81.66 a barrel. Another tough day for auto dealers across the country. At least 4 publicly traded auto dealers have warned the SEC in recent days of possible financial impact from that cyber attack that stalled service at car dealerships across the U.S. and Canada. Shares of Sonic Automotive, they're up 2%. Group 1 Automotive up 1.75%. Shares of AutoNation down 0.6%. Lithium Motors, among the publicly traded auto retailers, trading higher by 1.3%. So again, recapping here, S&P little changed, right now down by about 0.5 point. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
Charlie Pellet, thank you, and thanks for joining us here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio and television, as well YouTube, where you can always find us by searching Bloomberg Global News. Nice to be back with you, Kaylee Lyons, on a Monday here with some pretty important headlines coming out of Israel over the weekend. Israel to ease off Gaza fighting as focus moves to Hezbollah. One headline on the terminal, but also the question of a ceasefire right now, Kaylee, is very much up in the air, and it does feel like the 3-phase plan that Joe Biden rolled out several weeks back on a Friday in May is officially dead. The statement in an interview from Benjamin Netanyahu makes that pretty clear. Quote, "If there is an agreement, it will be on our terms, and that will not mean ending the war," unquote.
Although it seems that he did try to walk that back some when speaking to the Knesset today. He said, "We are committed to the Israeli proposal that President Biden welcomed. Our position has not changed." So it remains unclear what exactly the Israeli government's position is on forward progress on a ceasefire deal with Hamas. But to your point, Joe, we also have questions about what Israeli policy and tactic is going to be going after another Iranian proxy in Hezbollah to the north. Of course, there's already been a lot of activity on that border with Lebanon since October 7th. But what we're talking about here potentially is not just activity, but another front in this war.
That's true. And everyone we have asked on this program about this for the last couple of weeks here, and some pretty smart political and military minds, all have not only allowed for this possibility, but suggested to us that it is more likely than not to happen.
Well, we want to add another military mind to the voices we've asked about this. And welcome now General Kenneth McKenzie, former commander of U.S. Central Command, now executive director of the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida, and author of a new book, The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. General, welcome back to Balance of Power. It's great to have you. As we consider what we understand to be Israel's shifting focus toward Hezbollah and Lebanon, does Israel have the capacity to fight a two-front war? And does a two-front war very quickly turn into a regional one?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you here today. Always enjoy coming on your program. Israel does have the capacity to fight a two-front war, but it would be a war fought at a much higher level of risk, and there would be far greater damage to Israel if they enter this war. It's important to understand what hasn't happened so far is a massive LH, Lebanese Hezbollah attack into Israel. There have been tit for tats across the border, and many tens of thousands of Israelis have had to move south to be out of the range of Hezbollah. But Hezbollah has not chosen to strike south with the very lethal, very highly capable weapons that they've received from Iran. We'll know when that happens. That would be a major turning point. That has not happened to this point. But over the last 30 days, like many other people, my assessment is now there's an increased possibility of a war in the north.
That means you do not think it's inevitable, General. Is that right?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think Lebanese Hezbollah recognizes what would happen if they chose to fight Israel. I think Israel possesses the resources and the ability to damage Lebanese Hezbollah very badly. And LH and their leader Nasrallah is in a weaker state than they were the last time they decided to fight Israel. The last time they went to war with Israel in 2007, in that time frame, and a little bit after that as well, they were well ensconced in Lebanon. They had a more aggressive political support. The economy was doing not great, but okay. Today, the economy is in the tank in Lebanon. The political situation is fragmented and gridlocked. And there's a lot of blame for LH for those two situations because they've been the shadow behind the throne for so many years. It is inevitable that they're going to be blamed for the terrible condition that the average citizen of Lebanon finds them in. So as LH calculates going to war with Israel, they have to be aware that their political posture in Lebanon is weaker than it has been in the past. So they will think long and hard, I think, before deciding to fight Israel.
Well, as we consider the decision, not just on the part of Hezbollah, but also in Israel, and whether or not to engage more directly in this fight, if we were to see this second front open up, General, how much more difficult would that make normalization with other Arab countries like Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, a great question. Not sure it would necessarily impact it directly. The nations of the Gulf see Iran as their principal threat, and that is the greatest existential threat that they face. They need support from the United States to face Iran. They would like to have coordination with Israel to face Iran. So I think as they look at what's happening, as they have looked at what's happening in Gaza, and if they have to look at what might happen up in Lebanon, I think it will certainly be a factor. I don't know it would be a factor that would derail that process of normalization that is proceeding.
With all of that said then, General, what role, if any, would the U.S. play in a war with Hezbollah? Right now, the U.S. is giving money, it's giving weapons, it's doing everything but fight the battle with Hamas for the IDF. What would a war to the north look like?
A war to the north would be the most complex and demanding of all situations for the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Now you're looking at a two-axis war. As you noted, a war from the north. And Hezbollah is the largest non-state military entity in the world. They have tens of thousands of highly precise ballistic missiles and shorter range rockets that can hit population centers really virtually in all of Israel. A very different threat from those missiles than what was posed by Hamas, which was not a negligible threat either. But this would give Israel a two-front problem. And here's the other thing, and I think General Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, earlier today or yesterday, was very accurate when he said the physics of that problem, the geometry of that problem would make it harder for us to help Israel just because of the alignment of, if you look at the map, you've got a north-south alignment there, harder to get between them, harder to actually provide assistance. We can continue to provide assistance, but it's going to be material assistance. We are committed to the defense of Israel. This would probably require us to exercise that defense of Israel should a war begin, a significant war begin with Lebanese Hezbollah in the north.
So as we consider the ability of the U.S. to provide assistance on that front, there, of course, is the ongoing question of U.S. assistance provided as Israel conducts its ongoing operations in Gaza in the absence of any kind of temporary or permanent ceasefire agreement. General, given everything that we have seen, the competing messaging, it seems, from this administration, from the Netanyahu government in Israel, do you think there's a real prospect of a ceasefire?
I think there's possibly the prospect of a limited ceasefire. But, all of our attention has been focused on Israel because whatever you can think about the Israeli government, nonetheless, it's pretty much an open and transparent process. We don't know anything at all about what Hamas is thinking because they're a terrorist organization. And I don't believe actually their maximalist demands have changed from day one. So a lot of attention is focused on machinations inside an open society in Israel, but we're really not looking at the Hamas part of this equation. Hamas has no interest in this war ending. It is very much to their advantage to draw it out in time, to increase the rate of civilian casualties, to cast Israel in as unfavorable light as possible. And Hamas achieves this by embedding in the population of Gaza, placing Israeli commanders on the horns of a dilemma anytime they seek to strike a target, because Hamas has very cleverly drawn the civilians around them. So it's not in their interest, actually, their interest being Hamas. It is not in Hamas's interest to have a ceasefire.
General, you write in your book, The Melting Point, about the critical role that you played in the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's something that we talked about briefly last time you were with us. These days were fraught with risk, and what you and your troops went through is quite remarkable. We're going to see a presidential debate this week in which I suspect that withdrawal is going to come up. This is one of the great criticisms that the Biden administration has faced from a military perspective politically here since that happened. Does the president deserve that criticism?
Well, I think the end game in Afghanistan and what happened in August of 2021 was the direct result of two presidential administrations as unalike as any two in American history, and two presidents as unalike as any two in American history, who nonetheless shared one area of policy continuity. They both wanted to exit Afghanistan regardless of the consequences. So the plan was prepared under the Trump administration. The Biden administration did not execute the plan in detail, but they philosophically executed the same plan, which brought us to the situation that occurred in August and all the tragedy that occurred that month.
So, General, essentially you're saying that fault could be placed on both, but should greater fault be placed with the person or the administration that drafted the plan initially, or the one who decided to pursue it, to not change it, to not alter the end date?
The plan that was signed in Doha in 2020, February 2020, was a flawed plan. It was not a good plan, but it was a plan that had the conditionality, the requirements for both sides to act, had it actually been vigorously pursued by both administrations, not just one, but by both administrations, it is possible we could have gotten to a different place in Afghanistan. Neither administration elected to impose conditionality on the Taliban. Instead, we executed the tasks that we said we would execute, and we did that faithfully. With one exception, which is to stop attacks on us, the Taliban did not execute those conditions that were placed on them. Additionally, the act of cutting the Afghan government out of the negotiating process undercut them with severe morale effect on Afghans seeking to defend their country. So I would place blame across both administrations.
Well, you know, of course, that's what so many of the questions are geared toward. It's where we started this part of our conversation, is about where the blame should be, General. I'm curious about what you learned, though, going through this. You're writing about it in the book. The lessons that you learned about the civilian-military relationship and your duty to carry out orders from a civilian commander-in-chief.
So I think one of the most sacred principles of our republic is that the U.S. military, the joint force, as we call it, needs to be completely apolitical. And key decisions, need to be made by constitutionally selected civilian leaders. And that civilian leader, he or she, has the right to make that decision. They have the right to make a wrong decision. And unless the order is illegal, they have every right and expectation that the United States military will execute those orders. That's important. You never want to get into a situation where a four-star general says, I don't agree with this and I'm quitting. That is a political act. And the U.S. military does not ever need to get into the political business. That would be bad for the long-term health of the republic. And I would argue that that single action of choosing to resign or choosing to protest is more important than the goodness or badness of the decision that the political leader made, because it will echo through future years in U.S. history as a precedent. We don't need that kind of precedent. What we need is a U.S. military that will execute the orders of our elected leadership unless the order is illegal. When I was at Central Command, I had a squad of lawyers who could tell me what an illegal order was. But I knew what an illegal order was. I never received an illegal order. That's an important principle, and I think that's why I spent a little bit of time in the book talking about it. It's very important.
That's fascinating. He never received an illegal order. General Kenneth McKenzie, the book is called The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. General, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming back to talk to us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Some thoughts that we should all have in our minds when we watch that debate Thursday night, Kaylee.
Absolutely, especially if criticism or blame is being traded by both the former and current president. The general says that both kind of have that blame to share.
That's exactly right. Pretty remarkable conversation as we wrap things here on the fastest show in politics, getting ready to send the baton to New York. It's time almost for Bloomberg Business Week, and we'll meet you back here at 5 o'clock p.m. Washington time for the late edition of Balance of Power. It's Carol and Tim time. Good to see you guys.
Yeah, hey.
Good to see you too, Joe and Kaylee.
We're going to talk about narratives when it comes to high rates for longer and also get into the NVIDIA narrative, which seems to be changing, Tim.
Also, Mark Gurman on the latest with the Apple Vision Pro and all those challenges too in the EU.
All right.
Coming up next.
On Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week on this Monday, June 24th. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenevec. Tim, we are getting ready to wrap up, well, yeah, a trading day. But more importantly, we're talking about wrapping up a month by the end of this week, a quarter, and the first half of 2024.
Yeah, I'm already looking ahead to the third quarter of the year. And, of course, the 4th of July holiday next week. But a lot happens before we see that. We're going to talk a little bit about the market churn that's continuing. A round of records on Wall Street as we get ready to wrap up everything for the quarter this week, as we mentioned. High U.S. rates for longer or forever. It's kind of this narrative that's emerging. We got to get a roundtable on that in just a few.
Yeah, we've been talking about that. Very important to the market setup and really backdrop longer term. Plus the NVIDIA narrative as it really enters correction territory. We'll get into that one. Keep in mind, it's like 6.5% of the S&P 500 and almost 8% of the NASDAQ 100. So that kind of explains a lot, if you will, of the trade today.
Also, we got Apple's fresh warnings from the European Union and also the big plans that it's got for the Vision Pro. You have your Vision Pro yet, Carol?
No, I do not.
Not yet. Neither do I.
Tick, 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 tick. Hey, also, we're going to get into the libertarian billionaire who heads up one of Wall Street's most powerful trading firms and his ties to TikTok and to Donald Trump. We'll get into that. It's among our most read stories on the Bloomberg today.
And one more thing, the Wall Street shoeshiners that turn to cleaning sneakers to survive. All that and more over the next hour. First up, though, a check on the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much. Got one word for you, NVIDIA. The stock right now dropping by 5.6%. We're on the story. We got you covered right through the day here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. The Dow higher, holding on to a gain of 0.6%, but the S&P down now by 5, a drop there of 0.1%. NASDAQ now down 139 points for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a drop now of 0.8%. 10-year 4.25% with a 2-year 4.73%. Spot gold up $10 the ounce, $23.32, a gain of 0.5%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.2%, $81.73 for a barrel of WTI. Alnylam Pharmaceuticals soaring after its drug succeeded in treating a progressive and deadly form of heart disease, potentially opening up a new avenue for the company's top-selling product. Alnylam, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, seeing its shares surge right now by 36.5%. Again, recapping, S&P in the red, down 0.1%. NVIDIA cannot ignore this stock again today, down another 5.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. We're going to stay with NVIDIA. Charlie's setting us up really well. It is down about 3 days in a row. Not about, it is down 3 days in a row.
That is confirmed.
Done. And it's a drop of about 12%. So putting it past that 10% threshold that represents a correction, on track to wipe out about $400 billion, pushing its market cap below $3 trillion. I was thinking about our weekend last week, how we said largest market cap, most valuable company. Then it went back. So it was kind of that back and forth, if you will.
Okay, but for context here, it still is up 144% so far this year. The most expensive stock in the S&P 500, its shares trading for roughly 23 times the company's projected sales over the next 12 months, Carol.
Right, but as our team writes, Tim, there's a problem with the valuation. In the age of the AI boom, no one can really figure out what the chip makers' revenues are actually going to be, not the Wall Street analysts covering NVIDIA or NVIDIA execs themselves. Again, our Bloomberg team reporting that out. So how are investors supposed to calculate whether or not the shares are expensive or not? So here to help us tackle that question and really get, once again, to the fundamental story that is NVIDIA is Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Semiconductor Analyst Kujan Subani. He is with us from San Francisco. Kujan, it's good to have you here. We do talk with you a lot about NVIDIA and the fundamental story. Remind us of that and how you see it fundamentally. What is NVIDIA and the outlook for this company?
Yeah, and I want to bring back to sort of the numbers, right? Like whenever we are deviating, whether it's a hype or not, look at the numbers. Going back to sort of end of 2022, early 2023, when ChatGPT really came alive in the world. If you look at NVIDIA's numbers, right, it had about per quarter revenue of about $7 billion, approximately 10 cents of earnings. This is when the first time they started to see their data center revenue, from which is all the AI, really jump. Fast forward to right now, most recent, the revenues have increased 4x. EPS has increased about 7.5x. And as of today, the market cap from that point, which was 500 billion, sort of 6x. So if you look at the numbers, it was really a fundamental driven story. So that at least should help sort of clarify some of these hype versus reality and fundamentals, whether it justifies or not.
Okay, well, speaking of justification, a lot of people talk about the idea of NVIDIA having this moat. Nobody else is doing what it's able to do when it comes to building the hardware that all these companies need to train their AI models on, Kujan. So I'm wondering about when you think about projecting revenue revenues from a Bloomberg Intelligence analyst perspective here. How are you projecting revenues out over the next few quarters, over the next few years? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, similar to most sell-side analysts, we have also struggled to, get to the right number every quarter for them, and they keep on beating and raising. There's a few factors here. One, as you must have heard this so many times, they continue to remain supply constrained. So that's difficult for us to know, right? Like how much supply will come up and how much they can execute. And second, we keep looking at the spending pattern of their largest customers. I mean, look, in 2024, their largest hyperscale and cloud customers have already publicly announced that they are going to increase their capex by 40% year over year. And now there's even more than that. There's the tier 2 cloud providers, the AI cloud providers, and enterprise spending coming on. So we try to keep a close eye to see if there is any signs of demand slowing, which we don't see at this point.
What's the replacement cycle for chips from NVIDIA? Like, how long do they last? How long will they upgrade? You know, NVIDIA talks about kind of the upgrade cycle being pretty quick one. So I'm curious, are these companies that are the big spenders and that are building it out, are they going to have to replace their NVIDIA chips, I don't know, every 6 months, 12 months, 2 years? I don't know.
Yeah, that would be a good answer if you are in a normalized cycle for any chip, like you are in CPUs or for handsets. The challenge right now is all of the customers are just rushing to get most powerful chips they can get their hands on and continue building. So we have to wait and reach a digestion phase where they sort of reach a normalized spending period and they start thinking about, okay, now I'm going to refresh my older AI chips. So right now, I think this replacement cycle is really short, even if you want to call it a replacement cycle. As they come out with the newer Blackwell chips, their newer Grace Hopper, 200 series, customers are just picking them up and trying to put in as fast as possible, because the biggest gating factor right now in upgrading these AI servers is power. So every new chip brings a lot more TCO, a lot more power per performance efficiencies.
Kunjan, we can't let you go without asking you about potential competition here in the space. It's something we ask Ian King a lot about. Who else out there is doing something, at least on the development side, that could get close to NVIDIA? What's your perspective there?
I mean, on the merchant silicon, it's the only other name viable contender there is AMD, which we have talked about multiple times. Again, they are also but look, the system software mode that NVIDIA has, even with a good GPU solution, it's very hard to beat that. On the other end, there's the competition from the ASIC providers like the Broadcoms, not competing directly with NVIDIA's GPU right now, but I think in the long term, it is going to eat into the wallet share and the dollar spend that its customers would be spending on NVIDIA GPUs versus their own ASICs.
All right, Kunjan, I know you don't recommend stocks and so on and so forth, but this 3-day rout that we've seen that has wiped off about 10%, more than 10% off NVIDIA, it's, in your view, not because the fundamental story is coming undone. Maybe it's, for who knows what reason, but it's not because fundamentally NVIDIA is falling apart.
Definitely not. We don't see any fundamental flags right now, especially over the last week.
All right, well said. Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Semiconductor Analyst Kunjan Subani joining us from San Francisco.
Well, from the NVIDIA narrative to one about the U.S. rate environment and to another one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg today, it's about how just as optimism is growing among investors that a rally in U.S. Treasuries is about to take off, one key indicator in the bond market is flashing a worrying sign for anyone thinking about piling in.
Yep. Let's get into it with Bloomberg News economics editor Molly Smith in studio. Also with us is Bloomberg Intelligence Chief U.S. Interest Rate Strategist Ira Jersey. Ira's out there at BI headquarters in Princeton, New Jersey. I feel like I keep thinking of Lost in Space. Warning, warning, warning. And if you're too young to understand, Google it. All right, Treasuries on the cusp.
I know what you're talking about. Don't look at me.
You're not that young. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so Treasuries on the cusp of erasing their losses for the year, guys. Signs finally emerging that inflation and the labor market are both truly cooling. Ira, let me start with you. Traders betting that may be enough for the Fed to start cutting interest rates as soon as September. Is that what we're seeing right now?
Well, that is what the market's pricing. I actually suspect that the Fed will wind up waiting until sometime after the election to start its cutting cycle, but that's certainly why you've seen this rally. It's not because of supply, right? We actually get quite a lot of supply the next couple of days. But the fundamentals will still matter to the risk appetite for Treasury securities. They're still the most liquid, safest asset in the world. So when you have people who think that the economy is going to be slipping, and people want to just find a safe haven, they're still going to find Treasuries.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this idea that's raised in this article by our own Liz McCormick, the growing view that markets and that the economy's so-called neutral rate, the theoretical level of borrowing costs that neither stimulates nor slows growth, is actually much higher than policymakers are currently projecting. The idea that we are going to be high for longer or high for forever. Ira, what are you seeing when it comes to that front?
Yeah, this has been something that people in the market have been talking about for years, basically since 2022 and the inflation scare. It's, if the neutral rate used to be, say, 1%, it's probably meaningfully higher than that today because we have, significant shifts in the fundamentals of the economy, not to mention the fact that we do have additional, pressures on trade flows and the like. You no longer have the globalization helping to keep prices low for certain items. So the general consensus among almost every market participant is that it is higher than what it was for the last decade. The question is how high, right? Is it at 2.5% more or less where the Fed thinks, or is it more like 3.5%? There are a lot of people who believe that that's the case. Now, I actually think my view is that it is closer to 2.5% than it is to 3.5 or 4. But the fact that a large part of the market and many market participants think that it might be somewhat higher, and maybe the Fed can only cut interest rates by 150 or 200 basis points to get to neutral, will matter, and that is in a lot of people's market narratives.
Molly, come on in.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely Fed officials too, for what it's worth, who will say that the longer-term neutral rate, or what we call an economic circle, R star, if you want to get a little wonky with the jargon there, is that they will even say themselves that they probably think that rate is higher than what it used to be. But, I mean, Ira, just want to clarify this with you too, that R star is not necessarily the terminal rate here, right? I mean, those could be two different numbers of where the Fed cuts to in this cycle versus the longer neutral rate over time.
Yeah, that's right, Molly. So if you think about no one really knows where R star is, right? You can't know it ex ante because the fact is that the economy moves. There's a lot of changes that will happen over the next 2, 3, 5 years for determining, where is R star. So, if let's say that R star is 3%, right, just as a number, then presumably in a weak economic scenario, the Federal Reserve will cut to below that number in order to try to stimulate the economy. But again, no one really knows exactly where R star is. R star in the 1980s was much different than R star in the 1960s or 1950s. And that we can empirically know because we have economic evidence of where both short-term interest rates were and long-term interest rates. The other thing that I think is missed by a lot of these discussions about R star is that the financial system and the way that we fund is meaningfully different now than it even was 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. No corporation funds with short-term debt anymore. Just doesn't happen, right? So is R star where the Fed funds rate? That's going to have a much different effect on a corporate business and CapEx and the like today than it did 25 years ago when 25 or 30% of industrial debt was short-term debt that was going to be affected almost immediately by what the Fed did.
It's a really good point.
Yeah. Just to build on that a bit, I believe it was Adriana Kugler, Fed governor, who was speaking last week there. She was kind of alluding to this as well in saying that, R star is not what dictates monetary policy. To Ira's point, this is just I don't want to say imaginative, but it's really just more of a concept in theory rather than in practice. And what's more useful for policymakers is how to understand how restrictive policy is right now in the short term rather than estimating the neutral rate of interest in the long term.
Well, to that, I mean, the Fed has aggressively raised rates in the last year. We know that, right, before stopping. The U.S. growth has not fallen off a cliff. U.S. jobs market, I know there's a little bit of a debate out there, but it still seems tight, which makes one wonder, Molly, if the Fed policy is not restrictive enough right now and suggests that the neutral rate needs to be higher.
But then you also have the camp, though, who's arguing that monetary policy acts with long and variable lags. Just to throw that out there. But no, We all want to know. But no, that's exactly it, though, right? And that's exactly why, like, you're also wondering too, just like of the efficacy of policy in general, and like the transmission method, and like, do we have an economy that's just structurally more resistant to higher interest rates now than we did in past tightening cycles? That's also a possibility. And you look at like the percentage of homes that are mortgage free, and people who maybe are not relying as much on credit cards, and like these ways that would actually like affect consumers more directly. And it's clearly not showing up in more clear signs of stress in those parts of the economy.
Ira, let me just, what happened to the neutral rate during the Volcker era?
Well, so the neutral rate was probably much higher, right? It was probably more like 6 or 7%. But part of that was that there was much structurally higher inflation. And to one of Molly's points, how those long and variable lags of monetary policy are going to affect things goes back to what I was saying earlier about who has the debt, what sectors are doing well. If you look at inflation today, inflation right now is driven almost 100% by services, which is two factors, right? It's housing services and then non-housing services, right? But the non-housing service part of the economy is not affected by debt. Most people don't borrow money to start services businesses or to expand services businesses. They use cash on hand. So the thing is that you're not going to see a significant slowdown. Now, it's much different than the 1970s or 1980s when companies were levering themselves and borrowed a lot of money in order to make to invest in their businesses and expand. That's just not the case today, right? So the fact is that we've shifted a significant amount of the way that the economy functions, where interest rates are more, at least in my opinion, are much more of a sentiment kind of indicator as opposed to having real effects on the economy just because of the structural shifts in how we do business today versus previous generations.
Okay, so on this, Molly, I'm curious about the reads we get later this week when it comes to the Fed's preferred gauge of underlying inflation. What's expected here, and how could this sort of change the outlook?
Yeah, so it's probably going to be another favorable inflation print. I think most economists are penciling in just a 1/10 increase in the core PCE inflation gauge. So that would be, I think, the smallest since November, and pretty consistent with what we saw from the CPI and PPI reports a couple weeks ago. So, and I mean, look, I think like I know we talked about this last time too. I still find it just amazing how quickly the narrative has changed in terms of how we're thinking about inflation here. That we had the three horrible prints at the beginning of the year. We had 1 month that came in as expected, and now 1 month that's better than expected. And all of a sudden, inflation has resumed its downward trend. I'm not saying I necessarily disagree with that, but it's just amazing how we have really just kind of gone back to being fully optimistic that inflation is pretty much going down again.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, something we've talked about. Listen, both of you, thank you so much, really setting the right tone in terms of this week and what we are focusing on. Bloomberg News economics editor Molly Smith and Bloomberg Intelligence chief U.S. interest rate strategist Ira Jersey.
Hey, still ahead, the libertarian and head of a trading firm burrowed deep in machinery of modern finance. Also, TikTok, it seems, one presidential candidate, all coming together. Also, Redhead crossing the Bloomberg terminal. Novo Nordisk planning to invest $4.1 billion in another U.S. factory, plowing more money into its biggest market and rising discontent there over the cost.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We are looking at a very mixed market right now. Dow Industrials pushing higher. S&P, NASDAQ, both in the red right now. S&P lower, little change, down less than 0.1%. S&P at 54.59, down 4 points, down just about 0.1% now. We've got the Dow up 271, up 0.7. NASDAQ down 149, a decline of 0.8%. 10-year yield 4.24% with a 2-year yielding 4.73%. Gold up $11.50 the ounce to $23.33, up 0.5%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1.1%, 81.65 a barrel. RXO has agreed to buy United Parcel Services freight brokerage business, Coyote Logistics, for more than $1 billion. This deal will make RXO the third largest provider of brokered transportation in North America. RXO shares, they're surging now by 23%. UPS up 1.3%. FedEx, which reports tomorrow, up now by just about 0.9%. Again, recapping stocks trading mix. Dow Industrials trading higher by 0.7%. S&P down 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week on this Monday. Well, Jeff Yass, not a household name, a libertarian, a billionaire, a Wall Street veteran, obsessive poker player, big investor in the parent of TikTok as well, Tim.
Yeah, we're talking about the company called ByteDance. He's a former Never Trumper who's recently become an okay, fine, might as well be Trumper, so writes Bloomberg's Annie Massa in a story that is among our most read on the Bloomberg Terminal. It is today's Big Take on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com/Big Take. Annie Massa is Bloomberg News wealth reporter. She joins us here in the studio. Jeff Yass, okay, so he oversees Susquehanna International. As you write, it's a trading firm burrowed deep in the machinery of modern finance. He's a poker player. He wrote about options for his thesis in college. Why are we talking about him right now, though?
The reason he's in the news so much recently is he's a huge political donor. There are two things. He's a huge political donor. He kind of soared to the top of the list of biggest individual donors for much of this year in the 2024 election cycle. And then the second thing is that he is a major investor in an app that most of us have heard of, TikTok, or the parent company, app, ByteDance, which might be familiar to a lot of listeners. So for those two reasons, this kind of stealthy, veil of secrecy that he's spent his entire career enjoying has been blown up in the past year.
What's more important, his political aspect or the TikTok? Or is it just that it's both of those things combined?
They're a bit wrapped together. So he is a major libertarian. And one of the things that I wrote about in the story is his kind of conversion when he was younger to like libertarianism, and how at various points in his life he called on Milton Friedman personally for advice, and has kind of built his whole career and reputation that way. So he's always been a big donor to libertarian causes. But as far as politics go, and as far as TikTok and Trump go, this perfect storm happened in the past year where he came on people's radars for having been such an investor in TikTok, and then this flip-flop that Trump did in terms of TikTok and banning TikTok also kind of pinged people's radars. Like, why is he doing this?
We'll have the two had a conversation.
That's right. So there was this moment where they had a conversation at a big Club for Growth event in
Not at Mar-a-Lago.
Florida. Not at Mar-a-Lago. It was at the Breakers Hotel.
The other.
Yeah, the maybe more stately, cousin, but 10 minutes away. And so this conversation happened, and Jeff Yass's camp says that they did not discuss TikTok, but subsequently, Trump, has come out in favor of keeping TikTok on the phones of all Americans, and subsequently, Jeff has come out and said he will not donate money to Trump directly, but he supports him in the 2024 election. A
big flip-flop for the former president who, during his administration, tried to get TikTok to divest its American assets back in 2020. We'll get to more of that, but I want to talk about your reporting process for this, Annie. Who did you speak to? Who did you not speak to? And talk a little bit about how you reported out this piece.
Sure. Without going through the entire list of names,
was it a long one?
Of people I spoke to, I did kind of try and get into people who've worked at Susquehanna or worked there. Friends of Jeff's. He has now gathered so much attention that there are activist groups that are organizing local campaigns in Pennsylvania where they're showing up and, protesting outside the office or events. So I talked to those people. So I just tried to canvass locally in Pennsylvania because he is the richest man in Pennsylvania, and donates a lot to politics at the local level as well as the Wall Street component.
Does he, when he donates to politics, is it both sides of the aisle?
No, it's really to conservative causes. He will donate in some cases, but his most major spending is for Republican
I think
causes.
what's interesting about this story, and you write this, a billionaire flip-flopping for Donald Trump is nothing new, right? We are increasingly seeing that as we get closer to the November election. So no judge. But why single out Jeff Yes? And what did you want to know in all these conversations that you had, that you really paint an incredible picture of this guy from kind of being a little kid to where he is now?
Yeah, I wanted to know, basically my unifying question was, this is someone who focuses a lot at a professional level on decision making, which might sound a little bit basic, but he kind of built this whole company, as you said earlier, on poker and rational decision making in poker. So I was trying to really suss out, okay, so if this is the moment in which he's, going publicly on record and saying that he supports Trump over Biden, these purposes this year, I was trying to get inside his head as much as I could without talking to him about why he's making that decision now. And so
like the bet he's making, essentially, right?
The bet he's making, exactly, and what matters to him. So of course TikTok matters a great deal to him. He's worth $47 billion, but about a third of that comes from this early stake that his company took in TikTok. So that's a piece of it. But there are other dimensions to it. He's a huge supporter of this kind of controversial program of school vouchers. So we get into that quite a bit in the story. Mm-hmm. And that is something that's very much in line with Trump's former education secretary, Betsy DeVos, is a major supporter of school voucher programs.
One thing that I really liked about the story was the history of Susquehanna and how the firm came to be. And you write in the piece, Annie, that even though it's a financial firm and a lot of financial, it's essentially considered part of the financial elite, this is not something that's on Wall Street. This is not a guy who has homes right outside of New York City and commutes into New York City. This is Pennsylvania that we're talking about here. Talk a little bit about the location of the firm and who he's had in his inner circle, what they've gone and done since they joined the firm and have left the firm, and sort of what you learned there.
Yeah, so Susquehanna is based in a kind of unusual place for a big Wall Street firm. It's based in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. And the reason that they were in Philadelphia to begin with, he got started trading options. Options are what kind of built the foundation of this entire company in Philly. But as I write in the story, he not a huge fan of taxes, so he's always optimizing for tax purposes, and by moving from Philadelphia,
hates taxes. Like, it's pretty clear.
That is something. That's how people describe him.
Look, I think it's fair to say a libertarian doesn't necessarily love taxes.
The Club for Growth, right? Yeah. This group that he supports, as you say, it's an anti-tax political advocacy group, right?
Could accurately be described as an anti-tax.
Some would say he really hates taxes.
Yeah, I mean, all sorts of people would tell you that. I'm sure Jeff would tell you that too. But anyway, so he moved the company from Philadelphia to Bala Cynwyd. Even that marginal little move, saved money. Was savings on taxes. So you're tucked away.
He's allowed, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. But you're tucked away outside of the kind of fray of Wall Street. And so that is something particular to the firm. And they have this culture where they train you using poker techniques and playing poker in Texas Hold'em.
This is fascinating, right? When he hires someone, right, they actually are playing this.
Yeah, because they want to see how you make decisions. How do you go about deciding what, when you're playing a hand, whether to bet, check, or fold? And it actually doesn't matter as much, do you win or lose that hand, because luck can factor in. But did you make the right decision based on the probabilities and the players around the table, and they want to know how you made those decisions. So yeah, and so to your question, a lot of proprietary trading firms that are now kind of giants on Wall Street, the people who run those firms are often from Susquehanna.
Like a Jane Street, for example.
Jane Street is the perfect example, yeah.
But people want to know, these people who are kind of protesting against him, they want, the public at large want to, kind of say who he is, right? They want to get it out. They just got about 30 seconds left here, though.
They want people to know his name more, and they are trying to work to combat what they consider outsized influence in their state.
Right, which is we talk about follow the money with everything and anything, and he's not alone, right, in terms of big political donors.
Exactly.
Yeah. Incredible story, so much detail, another incredible piece of reporting, Annie. Thank you so much. Annie Massa, she's wealth reporter at Bloomberg News. As we said, this is among our most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal as we speak. It's also the Bloomberg Big Take, which you can find on the Bloomberg terminal at bloomberg.com/Big Take. So definitely check it out.
Hey, mixed market right now. The Nasdaq down close to 1 full percentage point. The S&P 500 down 0.1%. The Dow up 0.7%. Speaking of company shares moving higher, Apple higher amid headlines on a rift with the EU. What you need to know on the other side. First up, though, a check on the day's trade in the latest world of national news, I should say, with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. The Supreme Court signaled it's taking the unusual step of extending its term into July. It's finishing up work on about a dozen cases. That includes Donald Trump's bid for immunity from prosecution for attempting to overturn his 2020 election loss. And the Supreme Court is stepping into the fight over transgender rights, agreeing to hear appeals from the Biden administration and families seeking to block state bans on gender-affirming care. Emory University law professor Fred Smith says it's unusual because the U.S. government has decided to intervene in family lawsuits against a state.
It's the United States that has asked the Supreme Court to intervene, and that's not particularly common. And so it really does suggest that from the perspective of the federal government, that they view this as an issue where it's important to have a clear resolution.
Emory University law professor Fred Smith. The court will hear arguments in this fall. A high-ranking banker on Wall Street has resigned after this incident went viral. A 10-second clip on X showing a man throwing a punch at a woman in Brooklyn's Park Slope neighborhood. A police report shows the man is Jonathan Kay, the head of the Global Business Services franchise at Moelis & Company. Media reports say it happened during a fight over Israel's actions in Gaza. A Moelis spokesman says Kay has resigned. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are losing traction as an almost $400 billion plunge in NVIDIA raises speculation that the rally in the industry that has powered the bull market is due for a breather. Right now, we got the S&P in the red, down 4 right now, dropped there of just about 0.1%. The Dow is holding on to a gain of 269 points, up 0.7%, while NASDAQ is down 147, a decline of 0.8%. 10-year yield, 4.24%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.73%. Spot gold up $11 the ounce, up 0.5%, and West Texas Intermediate crude is up 1.1%, 81.65 a barrel. NVIDIA now down 5.9%. NVIDIA shares lower, with the AI-focused chipmaker entering correction territory as it extends a sharp recent sell-off. Again, NVIDIA right now down 5.9%. Recapping, the Dow higher, S&P lower by 4 points, little change, down less than 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Master along with Tim Stenovic live here on Bloomberg Business Week. Hey, one name that we're keeping a watch on today, Apple. Stock at its highs up about 2.5%. Right now, just up about 0.7%. There's kind of a slew of stories that are out there. Among them, our own Mark Gurman reporting on Apple's plans to turn Vision Pro into broader business. But before we get to that, there's also some fresh warnings from the EU when it comes to Apple over in that region of the world.
Yeah, the EU, the European Commission said that the U.S. company must allow developers in the App Store to steer users to cheaper deals and offer outside of the App Store. This in order to comply with the bloc's landmark Digital Markets Act. It lays out a raft of do's and don'ts, Carol, for some of the world's largest tech platforms.
All right, so let's get to it. Mark is back with us from Los Angeles. Mark Gurman, we mentioned out with a story on Vision Pro and Apple specifically. Mark, by the way, Bloomberg News Chief Technology Correspondent, joining us once again here. And Mark, we mentioned Apple shares just a little bit higher today. We do want to talk about your story on Vision Pro, but before we get to that, the EU rift that has widened, how are you thinking about that, this latest round of a dispute for Apple and the EU's antitrust regulators? I mean, is it time for Apple to kind of come to terms that none of this is going away in Europe and kind of rethink its approach to business there?
I think Apple has been doing everything they can to thread the needle, making the changes that the European Union is asking for in a way that they're not going to lose any revenue. Of course, as a public company and as a business, they believe that they have a fiduciary duty to do that. Long story short, the European Union is not happy with Apple's commissions, and so what they wanted is for Apple to open up iOS so users can download apps from websites and external app stores. And so what Apple's done is they've allowed that. But they're still asking developers to pay what's known as a core technology fee to reimburse them for every installation over a certain threshold. EU is not happy about that. So they are charging Apple with violating the Digital Markets Act, in part because of Apple still going after that revenue. And obviously, Apple has to be careful here. It is a slippery slope. They start opening up the App Store completely in one place. Other countries are going to want the same. Developers in other regions are going to push for that as well. And you could be talking about major risks to a $20 billion per year business. Now, Apple makes the vast majority of its services revenue from the App Store, and the vast majority, almost all App Store revenue, actually comes from in-app purchases. And Apple allows third-party payment services now for in-app purchase in the European Union, but they collect a percentage off of that as well. The DMA, the European Union, the bloc, they're not very happy about that.
So, Mark, one thing that we tend to see with companies in the tech space is they sort of make changes to satisfy a common variable or common denominator. USB-C, for example, I think it's fair to say we can look to what happened in Europe and a ruling there as to why USB-C is now available instead of the Lightning cable on Apple's newest pieces of hardware. Do we start to see changes that are made in Europe come to the United States?
I think eventually you're going to see U.S. regulators try to break up components of Apple, try to change some of Apple's policies regarding the App Store. The USB-C thing you mentioned is interesting, right? Apple fought tooth and nail over the USB shift. Now they embrace it. If you go to Apple's homepage, they tout USB-C on the iPhone. USB-C, there are benefits there, right? Now you have interoperability with more cables, more ecosystems, and now you can use the same charger on your iPad, iPhone, Mac, speakers, peripherals, all for the first time now that USB-C is on the iPhone. So there was a benefit there. What Apple pushed back against is, again, that slippery slope. They want USB-C today. What are they going to want tomorrow? What are they going to want the next day, right? If you give them a mouse a cookie, they're going to want a glass of milk type of thing. And I think that's what you're seeing with the App Store, that the more they move towards giving the European Union what they want, the more they're going to be asked to do.
If You Give a Mouse a Cookie is one of my favorite kids' books, and there's some other ones, so we'll talk about that later. Hey, speaking of markets, you've got a great story out about Vision Pro. You're right, it's gotten off to a bit of a slow start. Is that making Apple, Mark, rethink some of its expectations or its approach here?
I think what Apple sees for now is that the Vision Pro remains a very niche product. You go into an Apple store, maybe you see one or two a day, maybe one a week in some locations get purchased. A big test is going to be how the device fares in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, eventually places like Japan, Australia, UK, Germany, France. And that's going to show Apple if there's more demand for this product internationally, where maybe people are more willing to spend $3,500 US equivalent or more on a device that's essentially just a super powered TV for your eyes, right? And so they're going to have to see how that goes. But eventually, the real holy grail is going to be augmented reality glasses, getting something into the price of an iPhone that can replace an iPhone, that's lightweight, has the computational power and battery. That's going to take a really long time to pull off. That could be 5-7 years away from now to get something of that ilk. Now, in between now and then, what Apple needs to do is lower the price of the Vision Pro. Like I said, $3,500. They need to get it down to $1,500. But here's the problem. The Meta Quest 3 costs $500, $600. If Apple lowers the specifications of the Vision Pro in order to get it to a $1,500 price point, they may end up with a product that is actually worse than the Meta Quest 3, but it also is still 3 times the price. And so then you have to ask yourself, if you're a consumer, why would you buy that product? And so that's definitely what Apple's dealing with right now.
Okay, the price notwithstanding, Mark, what does the product roadmap look like for the next 5 to 7 years as Apple does work to get that Vision Pro into a pair of glasses? What can we expect from Apple?
Well, there's the cheaper one, right? Then there's the Vision Pro 2, faster processor, better hand tracking, better body tracking, camera improvements, trying to make the device a little bit more comfortable and lighter, new strap mechanism. The cheaper one, like I mentioned, iterating on that down the road, and then obviously the augmented reality glasses. The company has also been exploring smart glasses, similar to the Ray-Ban glasses with Meta, that would not include augmented reality. I don't necessarily think they would ever release that product. There's also AirPods with camera functionality being explored. That idea being to pair with augmented reality glasses, or being able to substitute cameras that would normally come in augmented reality glasses. And then there's other things that Apple's cooking up that have little to do with the Vision Pro, but I think they're still interesting on a forward-looking scale, would be home robotics devices. Anything from a tabletop iPad that could be on a robotic arm that moves to mimic head movements. You could be nodding your head, and the robot you have on your table at home could nod to show you that I'm nodding my head on a remote FaceTime call. And even the idea of humanoid robots.
I gotta
One
say,
day that
go ahead.
clean your dishes.
Finally, thank you.
Now you're talking my language. Hey, real quickly, there's another story out from Wall Street Journal. Meta having talks with Apple about integrating the Facebook parents' Gen AI model into the iPhone maker's AI system, Apple Intelligence. What do we need to know about that, or what are you hearing, if anything? Just got about 30 seconds.
So one, Apple Intelligence, there's 3 components. There's Apple's in-house on-device AI models. There's Apple's in-house cloud models. And then there's an API call out, which means that any chatbot maker can tap into that. So they're integrating OpenAI, they're integrating Google Gemini, and they're going to integrate any third-party provider, just like you can set any search engine as your search engine on a web browser. You'll be able to set your chatbot to any chatbot provider on your iPhone and iPad and Mac. And so Meta is obviously one of the providers of that. And so, of course, they'll be available down the road.
All right. Around the world of Apple we go. Mark Gurman, thank you so much. Bloomberg News Chief Technology Correspondent. Hey, coming up next, one more thing on Bloomberg Business Week has to do with a centuries-old trade. That's next.
news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Airbus has cut its annual aircraft delivery target to 770 units from a previous goal of 800 jets, citing persistent supply chain issues. The European playmaker now expects adjusted earnings before interest and taxes of 5.5 billion euros this year. That is down from a previous goal of as much as 7 billion euros. ADRs of Airbus, they are trading lower now by 4.7%. RXO has agreed to buy United Parcel Services freight brokerage business Coyote Logistics for more than $1 billion. The deal will make RXO the third largest provider of brokered transportation in North America. RXO shares, they're up by 22.8%. UPS shares up 1.5%. FedEx now up by 1.2%. Alnylam Pharmaceutical shares soaring after its drug succeeded in treating a progressive and deadly form of heart disease, potentially opening up a new avenue for the company's top-selling product. Alnylam shares up right now by 37.1%. Target is partnering with e-commerce specialist Shopify to expand its marketplace for third-party merchants as the big box retailer seeks to catch up with larger competitors Walmart and Amazon. Target up by almost 3%. Industrial and consumer packaging company Sonoco Products has agreed to buy Iviosis, that is a maker of cans and other packaging, from KPS Capital Partners for about $3.9 billion. And those are some of our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. The Supreme Court is expected to take an unusual step to extend its term into July as it finishes work on about a dozen cases, including Donald Trump's bid for immunity from prosecution. The court has already scheduled Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday as opinion days this week. The U.S. Supreme Court is also taking up the controversial issue of gender-affirming care, agreeing to review a lower court decision that upheld laws in Tennessee and Kentucky that banned transition surgery and treatments for children and young people experiencing gender dysmorphia. Emory University law professor Fred Smith says the issues include gender discrimination and whether a state can override a doctor's best judgment for a patient.
So you have kind of an equal protection question here because it implicates gender discrimination. And then you have a privacy issue here to the extent that it's interfering with really deeply personal medical decisions.
Emory University law professor Fred Smith. The Biden administration is announcing new steps to increase access to affordable housing as still high prices on groceries and other necessities and high interest rates have pushed up the cost of living in the post-pandemic years. Investments include providing $100 million through a new fund over the next 3 years to support affordable housing financing. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. Amy Morris there with World and National News out there in our D.C. bureau. All right, folks, one story that definitely caught our attention. It has to do with something that is kind of, I feel like it's been a given on Wall Street for decades, and that is the art of getting your shoes shined. I've done it. I've done it at a shoe shine that's been around here in New York for decades. You kind of go up and you sit and you get your shoes or your boots or whatever shine. But the pandemic has changed a lot of this.
Yeah, here's the problem because people aren't wearing as formal shoes today, and now a lot of people are wearing sneakers. Even Jamie Dimon wears sneakers to work sometimes. They don't need their shoes shined, so a lot of these shoe shiners are turning to other things like sneaker repair, cleaning sneakers, anything they can do to survive when the business is down.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really interesting is just looking at this story by Ignacia Gonzalez, sneaker cleaning services, we're seeing the search for that go up about 181% since January of 2021. And you see things like an Allbirds, or you even see Nike, suggesting, okay, here's an alternative. I've got a pair of Allbirds, right? They're really comfortable.
Yeah, of course those companies want you not to wear formal shoes because they sell not formal shoes, right?
But you see it. We see it with some of the executives or individuals around certainly certainly our headquarters, but it's interesting to hear Jamie Dimon, right? You know, iconic CEO on Wall Street and wearing some sneakers. Specifically, what does he wear? He wears Black Common Projects.
Okay, I got to check those out.
Yeah.
I don't have those. What I will say is it gets into some stories about cobblers who've been around for years, and there's nothing like finding a good cobbler in New York City or anywhere you live for that matter. What they can do to a pair of shoes that looks like it's beyond all repair,
redo them.
completely remake them, and make those pair of boots that are incredibly comfortable, that have a completely worn sole, good as new.
Sounds like someone who knows.
Oh.
Having said that,
Everybody has that pair of boots that's like gonna last forever. Just take it to a cobbler, get them completely redone. They're good as new.
what we will say, though, we talk about the higher prices for things or inflation hitting so many things. Rising costs have hit shoe shiners. The price of a shine rose $10 this year from $5 at Anthony's Shoe Repair, which is one of kind of the legendary, iconic ones here in New York City. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this hour of Bloomberg Business Week. Coming up now on television, the close for us, we're going to look into the U.S. presidential race's biggest crapshoot.
Also, why Amazon CEO Andy Jassy has been donning a hard hat.
And then we're going to check in with the head of consumer banking over at Citizens Financial on the void in private banking. Do not go anywhere. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Bloomberg Business Week continuing on radio, TV, and YouTube, actually, and on Bloomberg Originals. We'll be back to TV in just a moment when we head over to our TV colleagues. We're counting you down already to the closing bell. We've got most major industry groups in the S&P 500. They are higher at this hour. Having said that, you look at the major indices, the S&P and the NASDAQ, a little bit lower at this hour.
Yeah, a big part of that is what's going on with NVIDIA today. We're seeing shares down for a third day in a row. Shares down right now by 5.4%. More on NVIDIA in just a few minutes. Also, Carol, we're talking politics today. The Silver State, Nevada, we're talking about, an incredibly important swing state. Also the most inscrutable when it comes to polling. We're going to explain why.
Checking in with our Gregory Cordy in just a moment. Amazon changing its tune when it comes to corporate citizenship. We'll get into why the CEO, Andy Jassy, is wearing a hard hat.
Also, we're joined by the Vice Chair and Head of Consumer Banking over at Citizens Financial Group. He's trying to fill a void, or at least what he sees as a void when it comes to private banking.
Yeah, we'll get a check, too, on the banking environment in just a moment. First up, though, let's get an update on the trade with less than 59 minutes to go. Here is Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much indeed. Very much focused on NVIDIA today. I know you guys will be talking more about that in a moment. NVIDIA shares right off the bat here down 5.2%. It is now an update for the S&P 500 index. Barely. We've got the S&P up by 1 point, has been swinging between gains and losses. The Dow holding on to a 285-point gain, up by 0.7%. NASDAQ, though, very much in the red, down 111, a drop there of 0.6%. Bottom line here, stocks are struggling to gain much traction. 10-year, 4.25%. The 2-year, 4.73%. Gold up 0.5%, 23.32 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.1%, 81.61 for a barrel of WTI. Wall Street, meanwhile, looking ahead to Friday's reading on inflation. Katie Nixon is Chief Investment Officer for Wealth Management at Northern Trust.
We're probably here on Friday that inflation is, after a little tantrum earlier this year, inflation is continuing to disinflate just at a very good pace. We'll probably get a 2.6 core PCE, which is just on the Fed's target, which is going to allow the Fed, not require the Fed, allow the Fed to start cutting rates for the right reasons. So I think the setup for equities actually is really, really, really positive.
Katie Nixon of Northern Trust. Novo Nordisk plans to invest $4.1 billion in another American factory, plowing more money into its biggest market amid rising discontent over the cost of its obesity and diabetes drugs. The project in Clayton, North Carolina, will add about 1,000 jobs. Novo Nordisk down now by 0.2%. So again, recapping here, we got NVIDIA very much in the red, down 5.1%. S&P up barely higher now by less than 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Many thanks, Charlie Pellet. Hey, do want to mention a headline just crossing the Bloomberg. The Federal Reserve, that is, has shown other U.S. regulators a 3-page document of possible changes to their bank capital overhaul that would significantly lighten the load on Wall Street lenders. This is according to people familiar with the matter. The revisions would walk back key parts of the landmark proposal, including one that might have had a large effect on big banks with sizable trading businesses, according to those in the know. The Fed does not, this document doesn't include an updated estimate of how much additional capital that large banks would have to hold as a cushion against financial shock, something, of course, we know we all keep a close watch on. The people said early calculations suggest the proposed changes could lead to an increase as low as 5%. The original version, called for an overall 16% hike. I do want to point out the KBW Bank Index, which has been up most of the day, I saw a little bit of a spike. It's right now, though, up about 2%, Tim.
More of that story on the Bloomberg terminal. Just go and search for it on top or from Katanga Johnson, who ended up writing that story. So that's the latest on the Fed. Let's get to the latest on politics. Because of all the battleground states in the U.S. presidential election, none a greater puzzle for Joe Biden and Donald Trump than Nevada. It's because the state, with its relatively sparse population and high proportion of Spanish-speaking residents, is unusually difficult to poll. Gregory Cordy is Bloomberg News White House and politics reporter, and today writes about the inscrutability of the Silver State. Gregory joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. You are polling guru, Gregory, and polling discrepancies is exactly where I want to start. Give us an example of just how inscrutable Nevada is.
Yeah, I sort of wrote this story with you guys in mind because every time I come on this show, you guys ask such great questions about what are the polls saying and how do we trust them and how do we interpret them. And Nevada is a pretty interesting example of a state that you kind of have to look under the hood of the polling to understand it a little bit better. There are a couple of reasons why. One is you highlighted the large Spanish-speaking population. About 22% of the state speaks some language other than English at home. Most of those are Spanish speakers, and about 6 or 7% of those speak only Spanish. So if you're not polling in Spanish, that's a significant part of the electorate. And this is a citizen voting age population, right? So this isn't even, people who aren't there who aren't going to vote. These are voters who speak primarily Spanish, and if you're not polling in Spanish, you're not going to be able to measure that. The other thing that's interesting about Nevada, of course, is that it's the casino capital of the United States. You have a lot of shift workers working in the lodging, entertainment, food industries. About 40% of Nevada workers work some sort of non-traditional shift. They're not working during the day. And why is that important? Well, if they're working odd hours, second or third shift, they might be at work or they might be asleep during those crucial hours of 5 to 9 p.m. when pollsters traditionally call. They always call around dinner time, right? And they call to ask people. So if it's a phone survey.
I don't know. I've never gotten a call, Gregory. I've never gotten a call.
That's because you live in New Jersey, Carol.
Okay.
It's not a swing state.
Continue.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, and so those are a couple of the examples. And then the third thing is that just understanding the voter registration dynamics there and the trends. It's a very dynamic state. We've talked about this before. 19% of the Nevada electorate is new since 2020. It's a different electorate. And one of the things that pollsters will look at is what is the party registration balance. That's really hard to figure out because there's been a change in Nevada where by default you register as nonpartisan. And so it's really hard to get a handle on these new people who are coming to Nevada. Are they Democrats? Are they Republicans? Probably a few more of them are Republicans than Democrats. It does seem to be moving towards the Republican column after 4 straight elections of voting Democratic, but it's still very difficult to figure out.
That's what's interesting, too, that this idea, that Nevada has voted for the Democrat in every presidential election since 2008, but that would be, it's a big difference to see it shifting more red.
Yeah, and ordinarily, we would say, look, these are 6 electoral votes from Nevada. It's the smallest of the swing states that we're regularly checking in on with our Morning Consult poll that we do with Morning Consult. But those 6 electoral votes could sit at the fulcrum of the election. You have the blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. If Biden manages to win all those, and those are the ones he's best set up to win, he still needs at least one other electoral vote somewhere else. And so maybe that comes from Nevada, maybe it comes from somewhere else. But the thing is, there's such a wide range in the polling in Nevada right now ranging from Trump's winning by 12 or 13 points all the way to it's a dead even race. And so you have to think that Trump has the advantage there, but there's enough uncertainty there that it could be an election night surprise for Joe Biden if he's able to put together this coalition that includes a lot of these Hispanic voters and these casino workers who are members of the Culinary Union, which is a big turnout machine for Democrats in Nevada.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because over the last week, I think we've all seen and heard the portion of Donald Trump appearing there saying that he wants to not have taxes on tips. We've seen the way that he's talked about that. What is the Biden administration doing right now to try to appeal to voters in the state?
Yeah, they are really depending on the Culinary Union, as I just mentioned. That is a big turnout machine. Some people talk about the Harry Reid turnout machine. He's the former Senate Majority Leader who really was able to kind of bring together these service workers, these unionized Democrats, in the cities, especially Las Vegas, but also Reno, and have that sort of balance out the Republicans in the state. You think of it as a Western state, it's going to be a little bit more libertarian, obviously, a little bit more conservative in some fiscal ways, but Democrats have traditionally been able to leverage those workers who, by the way, are very late in sort of engaging in the political process. It's not until after Labor Day that they may start to pay attention. And so this is another reason why in Nevada we're going to watch these polls from now. It's still, 5 months before the election. We're going to continue to watch up until the election to see if those typical Democratic Biden voters begin to engage.
All right, so Gregory, how does Bloomberg and Morning Consult engage these potential voters in the state of Nevada in the polling process? How do you guys think about shifting how you are polling so to kind of meet, the various things you've just laid out in terms of Spanish-speaking residents or people who are working around the clock to make sure that the polling is as accurate as possible?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's difficult. And I'll have to defer a lot of that to our partners at Morning Consult, who are much more into the weeds on the methodology than I am. But a lot of it depends on these assumptions that we were talking about before. Again, this is what makes it difficult, is that after you do the polling, you also then want to weight by what your assumptions are of what the demographics are. So what we do in our Morning Consult poll is we take the responses that we get, but then if we're not getting enough Hispanic voters, if we're not getting enough union workers, if we're not getting enough Democrats or Republicans or people who voted for Biden or Trump 4 years ago, we weight the poll accordingly. And that is one method that we use to try to make sure that we're getting the right sample, but that can also be fraught if those subgroups that we're talking about, the ones that respond to polls, are somehow different from the ones who would not respond to a poll. Yeah. And that's something the pollsters are always trying to kind of figure out and hone their methodology to make sure that they're getting right.
Well, we definitely look forward to the next round of polling. Always fun to check in with you. Gregory, thank you. Gregory Cordy, he is White House and politics reporter at Bloomberg News, joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau.
Relationships to their employees and the communities where they operate. Some of Bezos' lieutenants even took pride in their institutional intolerance for frills. Hard-charging company was too busy changing the business world to stage a photo op with a mayor or field a grant request from an elementary school. Now, with Andy Jassy at the helm, though, Amazon has a new view on what it means to be a good neighbor. Matt Day is Bloomberg News technology reporter. He writes about Amazon's new view in the Bloomberg Tech Daily newsletter. To sign up, head on over to bloomberg.com/technology. Matt joins us from Seattle. Matt, good to have you on with us this afternoon. How would you characterize Andy Jassy's view on corporate social responsibility and I guess, quote unquote, town gown relations?
So Andy Jassy is kind of cut from a different cloth than Jeff Bezos. Bezos very famously got to start on Wall Street, kind of a dollars and cents, likes to question conventional wisdom of all sorts. Andy Jassy was sort of a marketing guy, at least in the early days. And so he very well knows kind of the value of getting your name out there in a good way, of not necessarily being transactional about everything, So I think he more intuitively than Jeff Bezos did, kind of understands that you have to show up, philanthropically a little bit if you're a company the scale of Amazon. He understands you got to, do right by your employees. And I think Amazon telegraphed this real well when just a couple of days before Andy Jassy took over back in 2021, suddenly Amazon's guiding credo had two new mandates attached to it, right? And they were basically consider your employees and consider, the impact of your actions on society, right? They kind of asked Amazonians for the first time really explicitly to, consider society, consider the wider world.
Why is this happening? Is it just an Andy Jassy thing, or is there something, I don't know, different going on at Amazon, and why now?
I think the seeds were definitely planted late in the Bezos tenure. And it was really he has this famous saying, Amazon's going to be misunderstood for a long time. Eventually people started to try to understand them. And when they did, it was folks like the New York Times writing the, now legendary in the halls of Amazon, crying at their desk story about how hard white collar workers were pushed. There's a lot of negative reporting on working conditions for Amazon's hourly workers in warehouses. So they just got to a scale where you kind of had to start, doing some of this stuff that they had no interest in before, if nothing else to, in their eyes, kind of counter the, Amazon's this big, terrible monster sort of view that was percolating out there in some quarters.
Well, let's talk about what's happening on the ground in Seattle and maybe neighboring Bellevue as well. Matt, you've covered this company for quite a while. As Amazon has grown, the city has changed quite a bit. And certainly unhoused populations are a center of attention in the city. Housing affordability is an issue there. Poverty is an issue there. Talk to us a little bit about what we've seen in Seattle coincide with the rise of Amazon.
Yeah, so you wind back the clock in Seattle a long ways. It was really a blue-collar town and a relatively affordable place by the standards of big West Coast cities. That started to change in the 2010s, commensurate with Amazon's arrival, right? They went from a few thousand employees when they moved into their new campus, built in a warehouse district in Seattle in 2010. 10 years later, they had 50,000 people. So Amazon, not the only reason Seattle got more expensive, but it was a big one. So as homelessness, as traffic, as all the other civic issues burbled, they were an easy target. And a lot of people, politicians included, the Seattle City Council for a while, and almost a majority of people would have said, hey, this is Amazon's fault, and sort of pointed at them. They really became kind of a lightning rod in Seattle as their growth supercharged in the 2010s and continued through the pandemic.
Hey, Matt, one thing we wanted to ask you, because it comes up in a lot of our conversations for Tim and me, is, post-pandemic, post-George Floyd, there were a lot of companies who came out and said, we're going to be better, whether it's, diversity, inclusion, thinking about our community much more broadly, wellness. There was just so much that was going on, thinking about the worker, all stakeholders, as they say. And I do wonder, as you report this out and what you're hearing, and Amazon under Andy Jassy, is this really something that's going to be intrinsic to Amazon's corporate culture? Or, dare I say, is it, kind of greenwashing to some extent?
I think it depends on who you ask. Amazon is still a place that is really good at grading you on the metrics that matter. And for a lot of folks, the metrics that matter are still, how many units did they ship? Did they complete the software widget on time? That kind of thing. But I think you really can't overstate the importance of Andy Jassy, from the top saying something like, going back to that summer saying Black Lives Matter, right? Mm-hmm. He took the mic at his big tech conference, said that publicly. And that was strange for an Amazon exec at a time. They just didn't do that. They were very, focused on their box and getting stuff to their customers. So just the fact that optically anyway, the boss says, listen, this is something that I think is important, that you should prioritize. I think that's got to have some impact.
Just in the last 30 seconds that we have with you, Matt, what have they done from a philanthropic standpoint, or at least from a corporate social responsibility standpoint, that's moved the needle?
So the housing fund's a big one. They've billions in low interest loans. They've offered, sustainability. They're charging toward a net zero premise that they didn't have until 2019. Really across the board, they're at least checking the boxes in a way that they didn't, really at all 5 years ago.
All right, going to leave it there. Hey, Matt, thank you so much. Always appreciate you talking us through the latest on Amazon. Matt Day is a Bloomberg News technology reporter. I do want to point out shares of Amazon just down about 1.4% in today's session, but the stock is up about 23% so far here in 2024.
Okay, well, the S&P 500 is flat right now, barely in the red. The NASDAQ composite down about 0.6%, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average, Carol, up 0.7%.
Yeah, just got about 40 minutes to go low in today's session. So continuing to watch the trade here for you on this Monday. Coming up next, though, even though we've seen lots of progress when it comes to companies supporting various issues, including LGBTQ employees, majority feel like sharing details about their personal lives will hold them back. So we're going to tackle that. That's coming up next. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Master, Tim Stanovic. We are Bloomberg.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We got Bitcoin right now below 60,000, down 5.8%. Nvidia selling off, down 4.8%. U.S. stocks are trading mixed. Right now, Dow Industrials up by 269 points, a gain of 0.7%. S&P lower, little changed as it has been for much of the day, swinging between gains and losses, down 2 points. We've got NASDAQ down 111, a drop now of 0.6%. 0.3%. 10-year 4.24% with a 2-year 4.73%. Gold up 0.4% right now, $23.31 the ounce, up $9. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.1%, $81.66 a barrel on WTI. Stocks lost traction as an almost $400 billion plunge in NVIDIA raised speculation that the rally in the industry that has powered the bull market is due for a breather. As for the market backdrop, Ann Berry is managing partner at Threadneedle Ventures. She was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
I think people are saying, look at where the market is now before the rate cuts have even come into fruition. Right, so if you look at tech in particular, if you look at the growth stocks, if they're sustaining these valuations now despite uncertainty, what is it going to look like when rate cuts get real? Right, so that would be a driver to the upside.
Threadneedle's Ann Berry, the industrial and consumer packaging company Sonoco Products, has agreed to buy Eviosys, a maker of cans and other packaging, from KPS Capital Partners for about $3.9 billion. Sonoco shares right now down by 4.1%. Recapping, NVIDIA down 5%, S&P down 2 points, lower little changed. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Do appreciate it. June is Pride Month, and all this month, Bloomberg Business Week is featuring voices on topics related to equality. You might remember, just a couple of weeks ago, we spoke to Sarah Kate Ellis. She's the CEO and president over at GLAD. Catch that conversation in our weekend podcast, by the way. According to GLAD, a study they did last year, 70% of non-LGBTQ people agree that companies should publicly support and include the LGBT community through practices like hiring, advertising, and sponsorship.
It was a great conversation. I feel like an eye-opening, and some statistics she shared with us in terms of acceptance, which is still an issue. She's been doing that, Sarah Kate Ellis, that is, for 10 years. And yes, progress, but there's a lot more to go when it comes to acceptance more generally.
Yeah, no question companies, for their part, have gotten more outspoken in support of LGBTQ employees.